In the last week of June 1462, Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, is marching his army through Wallachia, known today as southern Romania. It's all part of a grand project to bring the Balkan territories of Eastern Europe under the Ottoman yoke. Although it's been a troubled campaign, Mehmed has been able to more or less get the best of his opponent, Vlad III. Vlad, who commands an army less than half the size of the invading Ottomans, is forced to resort to guerrilla tactics, the consequences of which are just about to be witnessed by Mehmed. As the Sultan marches into the Wallachian capital of Targovishte, they come upon a site that will go down in history as the Forest of the Dead. In the words of Austrian diplomat Johann Schedel, when the Ottoman soldiers entered the land, they were met by a gruesome sight. Countless men and women, some still alive, others dead, each pierced upon a tall stake, rising like trees in a forest. The sight was said to be so terrifying that even the bravest men hesitated to march forward. The Sultan had looked out to see 20,000 people, including women and children, impaled on stakes for Vlad's enemies to see. In some cases, women and their infant children were skewered on the same spike. Of course, some of those impaled would have been corpses from earlier skirmishes that Vlad had erected, but others would have been civilians guilty of collaborating with the Ottomans, and these would have been skewered alive. In fact, as Johann Schedel says, some of these victims were still alive among the Forest of the Dead, groaning and crying in agony, too exhausted to scream for help. And the author of this depraved display is none other than Vlad III, known more popularly as Vlad the Impaler. For Mehmed II, it was an awe-inspiring sight. Although he was just 30 years old at this time, he'd been in power since he was just 19, and he was no stranger to violence. In 1453, Mehmed had personally overseen the capture of Constantinople, effectively ending the Byzantine Empire. When his attacking forces finally got into the city walls, Mehmed offered those inside no quarter. The Byzantine historian Ducas tells us that the invaders poured into the city like a tidal wave, slaughtering everyone in sight. No mercy was shown to the men, women, or children. The streets ran red with blood. There was no place to hide, and the defenseless citizens were hacked to pieces without distinction. So, young Mehmed II was no angel himself. In fact, he was perfectly comfortable with violence, even when it was directed at civilians. But even for this experienced and bloodthirsty general, Mehmed, the sight before him was too much to bear. And it's not just Mehmed who struggled. Some of his most hardened soldiers cringe as they see a bird's nest nestled into the open stomach of one of the corpses. Vlad had turned the countryside of Wallachia into a canvas of malice and horror, with the sole intention of terrifying the Ottoman forces into a retreat. And it worked. The historical sources tell us that when the Sultan saw what lay before him, he said that it was not possible to deprive such a man of his country. With this, Mehmed withdrew from Wallachia, leaving behind a rival warlord named Radu, a man who just so happened to be Vlad's brother. For Mehmed, it was a reasonable decision to make. Impalement is one of the absolutely worst fates to endure, and even witnessing a single case would be enough to turn your stomach. And Vlad had just done it to up to 20,000 people. For Mehmed, it was better to leave Radu behind to deal with him. And although Vlad had his own twist on impalement to increase the horror, this brutal punishment had been around in one form or another for much of our past, and it's one of the oldest forms of capital punishment that we have records for. It's first mentioned around 1700 BC in Babylonian law under the Code of Hammurabi. Law 153 specifically states that if the wife of one man on account of another man has their mates, her husband and the other man's wife, murdered, both of them shall be impaled. Historians think this would most likely be transversal impalement, which means that the stake would be driven through your abdomen or your chest and then come out through your back, at which point you'd be hoisted up into the air to dangle for an audience below. Since this would require driving the stake directly through major organs, death would come very quickly, perhaps even instantly. So it's grim stuff, but it's nothing compared to some of the later innovations. In the 9th century BC, just under a millennia later, Ashurnasirpal II of Assyria records the events that followed after he put down a revolt within his kingdom. As punishment for the rebellion, those who took up arms against him receive a brutal punishment. To quote the Assyrian king directly, "I stormed the city, I captured them alive, I burned their boys and girls. Some I impaled on stakes, others I flayed. Their skins I spread on the walls of the city. I hung their heads from trees in the palace garden. I filled the wide plain with their bodies, like grass after a harvest." It gets darker though. Unlike the transversal impalement used in Babylonia, the Assyrian king was having his victims impaled longitudinally or vertically, also known less formally as rectal impalement. If we take a look at these stone engravings which commemorate the event, we can see that the stakes enter the victim below from between the legs, at which point they're left to dangle and perish. This can still though get worse, and this is where we get to Vlad and his forest of the dead. See, the Assyrian method of impalement would have used a sharpened stake, which would mean that through the process of being skewered, you would bleed a lot, and this bleeding would finish you off fairly quickly. It's still a horrifically painful and humiliating way to die, but death would be with you in minutes, at most an hour. But that all changed with Vlad's innovations. He would swap out the sharpened spear for a slightly thicker, almost blunt stake, which would be heavily lubricated with either animal fat or oil. The victim would then be laid on their front, and the stake would be slowly and methodically inserted into the body, through either the rectum, or if happening to a woman, then I won't say it, but through there. The stake would then be driven through the torso, supposedly following along the spine, in order to avoid piercing any vital organs and allowing the victim to get off too easily. Once all the way through, the stake would then rest just under the clavicle or near to the neck. At this stage, the slow, methodic pushing of the stake would be swapped out, and the executioner would take a mallet and strike the base of the stake, causing the sharper end to smash through whatever bones were in the way and emerge from the victim's shoulder, throat, or chest. Of course, this would have required an immense level of dexterity and precision, so it's reasonable to assume that a lot of these impalements were botched, meaning that the victim would be likely to have an organ or blood vessel pierced, leading to a far quicker death than intended. But this was no guarantee. If the executioners wanted to make the death faster, then the stake could also be driven through the esophagus, emerging out the victim's mouth, as shown here. Nonetheless, once the impaled was sufficiently skewered, then the stake would be raised, lifting the victim into the air to dangle in pure agony. Depending on the skill of the executioner, death could come within hours, sometimes not for days, with victims often perishing from exposure rather than blood loss or trauma, which was probably the case for those who were still alive when the Ottomans came marching through the forest of the dead, where, as we said, up to 20,000 people were subjected to this grim fate. And that's the other innovation that Vlad brought to the table. Not only was he able to perfect this execution in such a way as to draw out the suffering for as long as humanly possible, but also to conduct the process en masse, demonstrating to any onlooker that this, the most extreme of punishments, for Vlad, was just another day at the office. Despite his initial success in getting Mehmed to retreat, Vlad would ultimately pay for his keenness to impale his victims. When his brother Radu was installed as the competing ruler of Wallachia, the local nobility almost immediately flocked to Radu's cause. See, Vlad hadn't just been terrorizing the Ottoman invaders, but had also been subjecting his own people to this brutal end, including one event known to us today as the Easter Impalement. In 1457, during the early months of Vlad's reign, he called the Wallachian boyars, the nobility basically, to attend a feast held to celebrate Easter Sunday. Although Vlad already had a reputation for extreme violence and outbursts of rage, the boyars knew that refusal to attend would be more dangerous than whatever temper tantrum he may fall into during the celebrations, and so almost the entire Wallachian aristocracy and their families attended this feast. On the day of the big celebration, things were tense at first, but after a few drinks and a bite to eat, the mood turned merry and the boyars started to relax. Perhaps, they might have thought, this Vlad guy isn't so bad, and perhaps his reputation for cruelty was just an exaggeration, but after a few hours pass, Vlad asks his guests an unassuming and seemingly harmless question. How many rulers of Wallachia have you seen come and go in your lifetime? To us, this might seem like a strange thing to ask, but Wallachia was extremely politically unstable during this stage of history, as puppet kings from either the Ottoman Empire or the Kingdom of Hungary were repeatedly throned and then dethroned in the game of chess for control of Eastern Europe. So, when Vlad asks his question, the number he receives back from his guests is predictably quite high. Some of the younger boyars answer first, saying that they had seen perhaps 3 or 4 different rulers come and go through Wallachia in their lifetimes. Eventually, one of the oldest guests at the party says that he has seen as many as 15 separate individuals pass over the throne. When Vlad hears this, his tone changes in an instant, and with the jovial smile completely wiped from his face, he tells his guests flatly, "In that case, I can't trust any of you, since clearly none of you have been loyal to a ruler in your entire lives." Vlad had quite cleverly, and through a seemingly innocent question, tricked the boyars into admitting that they weren't personally loyal to any particular ruler and were happy to stand on the sidelines and benefit from the constant power shifts between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. On top of that, Vlad's father had been assassinated while ruling Wallachia, and his brother had been blinded and buried alive. Vlad knew that in order for these things to have happened, the boyars must have been complicit in these events, and so he wasn't just pursuing an impersonal political goal to consolidate power, but was also settling some bad blood between his family and the Wallachian boyars. Almost immediately after telling the boyars that they couldn't be trusted, he had them all arrested and then divided them into 2 groups. Those who he considered sickly, weak, or old were all impaled in that same way we described before, through the rectum and out from the shoulder or the chest. The rest of the boyars were forced to watch their friends and families as they were skewered alive, and then, after the show was over, they were marched off to a life of slavery and forced labour. This immediately made the remaining boyars and aristocrats unbelievably hostile to Vlad, and it's not surprising that when an alternative came in the form of Radu, the Wallachian nobility immediately switched sides. Even if this new ruler, Radu, was an Ottoman puppet, at least he wasn't going around impaling anyone he perceived as an enemy. Left without his power base, Vlad fled to Hungary in 1462, where he was placed under arrest by King Matthias Corvinus and spent approximately 12 years in captivity. He was eventually reinstalled as Voivod of Wallachia in 1476 with the backing of the Hungarian crown, but his 3rd reign was brief. It ended that same year when he was killed in a battle against the Ottomans, likely near Bucharest. His head was then sent to Sultan Mehmed II, preserved in honey and displayed on a spike in Constantinople to prove that the Kazikli Bey, the impaler lord, was truly dead. But despite perhaps being one of the most famous impalers in history, this gruesome method of torture wouldn't end with Vlad. In fact, we have one of our best historical accounts of impalement from a French merchant named Jean de Thévenot, travelling through Egypt in the 17th century. It's quite long, but I've done my best to trim it just a little so you can hear it in Jean's own words. They lay the malefactor upon his belly, with his hands tied behind his back. Then they slit up his fundament with a razor and throw into it a handful of paste that they have in readiness, which immediately stops the blood. After that, they thrust up into his body a very long stake, as big as a man's arm, sharp at the point and tapered, which they grease a little before. When they have driven it up with a mallet till it come out at his breast, they lift him up. One day I saw a man upon the pole. The stake was not thrust up far enough to come out at any point of his body, and they also put a stay pail to hinder the weight of his body from making him sink down upon it, or the point of it from piercing him through. In this manner he was left for some hours, during which time he spoke, and turning from one side to another, prayed those that passed by to kill him, making 1,000 wry mouths and faces because of the pain he suffered when he stirred himself. After dinner, the basher sent one to dispatch him, which was easily done by making the point of the stake come out at his breast, and then he was left till next morning when he was taken down, because he stunk horridly. Now, gruesome as all this is, we humans would still be at this by the 18th century, where a different form of impalement was still in use in Dutch Suriname as a punishment dished out to rebellious slaves. The twist here is that instead of using gravity as a method to push your body down the stake, they would use gravity to pull a hook up through your ribcage, as can be seen here. And again, good gosh, we never learn. We have reports of impalement being dished out as late as the Second World War, where Japanese soldiers are recorded to have used a form of impalement called bamboo torture, known to the Japanese as takini yorishu, or death by bamboo. This worked by tying the victim to the ground above freshly planted bamboo, which grew with sharp edges and up to 8 inches per day, quickly pushing its way through the victim, but doing so just slow enough for the body to heal around the injury, prolonging suffering and drawing out the death. The soldiers would even provide the victim with just enough water or food to help them push further, hoping to prolong agony for as long as they could. Nicolas Jacques Pelletier was marched from his cell to a scaffold above the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. He was a known highwayman and was about to be put to death for a robbery in which at least one man was killed. By the day of his execution, Pelletier had actually already spent the last 6 months in prison, while the authorities argued about how they should put him to death. See, a law in late 1791 had been passed which made decapitation the only legal method of capital punishment. Some argued that Pelletier should have his head cut from his body by an axeman, as was traditional, but many argued that a new method could be used, a brand new machine called a guillotine, which was supposedly more effective and more reliable than any human executioner. But at this stage, it had only been used on animals and corpses. The High Executioner of France, Charles-Henri Sanson, recommended the guillotine, and his words were taken seriously. On the 23rd of March, it was made official that Pelletier was to be put to death by guillotine, and so on the 25th of April, he was to be the first man ever to die at the hands of this contraption. At least, that's if it would work on a living subject. By 3 p.m. that day, a large crowd had gathered and were waiting curiously to see this new toy be put to use. By 3:30 p.m, Pelletier, wearing a red shirt, was marched towards the guillotine. High Executioner Sanson took Pelletier, forced his body prone onto the table, and then fed his head through the opening, so that the blade was lined up to fall on his neck. Within just seconds, Pelletier was in place, and the blade fell clean through, leaving his head to thud into a basket below. The machine had worked. A success. But the crowd were not impressed. Sanson, who had by now taken part in hundreds of executions, was stunned to see that the spectators in the street were screaming abuse at the guillotine and himself, and were crying maniacally about how much they hated the whole affair. He heard people from the street yelling, "Bring back our wooden gallows!" See, they weren't angry that a man had been killed. They were angry that the guillotine had taken all the fun out of it. It wasn't bloody enough. It was all over too quickly. It was too clinical. It was too nice for those nasty criminals. France was trying to move away from using punishment as macabre theatre and towards a system where justice was swift, equal, and painless. And the project wasn't popular. But, to the relief of the crowds, the guillotine would come back as theatre very soon. To put all this in context though, we need to go back 35 years to when that High Executioner Sanson was just 18 years of age and was ordered to perform one of the worst executions in all human history. In January of 1757, a man named Robert François Damiens was put to death after he tried to assassinate the then King Louis XV of France by attacking him with a knife. Although the attempt was unsuccessful and the king survived, the French authorities were determined to bring the full weight of the law down. What happens next is bad. If you're not into gore and pain and all that, just go watch something else or skip ahead a bit. But I promise, This is to do with the story of the guillotine, and we're not just on a gore fest here. So Damiens was sentenced to public execution on March of 1757. When Sanson arrived to collect him from his cell, he said only, "This day will be hard." And my God, that was the understatement of the century. The whole ordeal started with Damiens having his legs broken. They did this by clamping his feet and lower legs into cast iron moulds, and once inserted, they would use a mallet to drive chunks of wood into the gap between the iron mould and his shin, taking away chunks of skin and flesh as the wood is nailed downwards, and eventually crushing and fracturing his tibula and fibula. After that, they burned the hand that Damiens used when he was holding the knife, and they did this with a mixture of molten lead, hot wax, boiling oil and burning sulphur. The sulphur here, of course, having connotations of hell and more punishment waiting for him in the afterlife. Once his hand was taken care of, they then started to pick at him with red-hot pincers, essentially grabbing, burning and tearing off little gobs of flesh and leaving behind shallow wounds and chunks of muscle and skin that were missing. These missing chunks were then filled in by having that same mixture of boiling lead, oil, sulphur and wax poured into the open wounds with a punishing sizzle. We're not yet done, by the way, because after this he had his sexual organs removed with a blade and was finally laid on his back when Sanson and his men tied each of his 4 limbs to 4 strong horses, all facing in a different direction, so that when they ran, he'd be dismembered. Damiens, however, didn't part with his limbs easily, and so the first attempt was unsuccessful. The horses dragged and pulled against his shattered legs and charred arms, but inflicted only pain. So Sanson reached into Damiens' armpits and groin, where he was able to isolate and cut the tendons within his limbs, after which he sent the horses bolting for a second time, which worked, and Damiens' arms and legs were torn from his body, leaving only his head and torso on the ground. According to sources, he was still alive at this point and uttering the words, "Death, what's taking you so long?" Sanson then scooped up what was left of him, tied him to a stake, and then burned him alive. Casanova, who was an eyewitness to the ordeal, said, "We had the courage to watch the dreadful sight for 4 hours. I was several times obliged to turn away my face and to stop my ears as I heard his piercing shrieks, half of his body having been torn from him." All of this, of course, was very horrible, but it was this event where the story of the guillotine begins. See, although Damiens' execution was intended to be a display of the king's terrifying power and a shock tactic to preserve the position of the royals in France, the actual effect, however, was that it just galvanised intellectuals such as Voltaire, Thomas Paine, César Beccaria and Edmund Burke against the tyrannical style rule of monarchy like that of the Ancien regime in France, which was quickly becoming seen as brutal, capricious and unjust. The following half of that century would see these frustrations simmer until they exploded in 1789, when France suddenly found itself in the throes of a full-blown revolution, and France's monarchy was replaced with a new government based on ideals of equality, fraternity and liberty. We're not going to get into the specifics of the French Revolution in this video because it's very, very complicated. But basically, while these new revolutionaries were discussing new ways of governance, a new calendar, a new state religion, and so on and so forth, they were also discussing new ways to change crime and punishment and coming up with interesting methods to dispatch their political enemies. See, at the time, most European thought around law and order emphasised making public examples out of people with punishments that fit the crime, like Damiens. This was based on principles like deterrence and lex talionis, an ancient legal idea that basically means an eye for an eye. But these new French revolutionaries wanted to change the emphasis away from public variety shows, obscure punishments and deterrence, and more towards a rights-based system where justice was swift and equal. In May 1791, one such revolutionary named Louis-Michel Lepelletier de Saint-Fargeau declared that from now on, any sentence involving the death penalty should be the simple deprivation of life without any torture added to it. By December of that year, it was law. Article 4 of the Criminal Code of 1791 stipulated that every person condemned to death shall have his head cut off. This was, by the standards of the time, quite humane and progressive. The death penalty was no longer about inflicting suffering on criminals, but now it was about depriving them of their rights, even if that was the right to life. It was also fairly egalitarian, because before all this, beheading was considered to be the aristocratic, high-status way of being knocked off, whereas the poor were typically just hanged. A painless, consistent method guided by a rights-based system to put people to death seemed like a step in the right direction. The problem was, they didn't bother to specify how this beheading should happen, and there was a big question mark about how they were actually going to do it. If this was supposed to be a standardised, fair and painless way to die, then leaving it up to an axeman wasn't going to cut it. Manual executions performed by swordsmen or axemen often came with errors. Missed swings, the need for a second or even third swing at the victim, axes and swords chipping and breaking, leaving people half dead. It just wasn't efficient and it wasn't clean. But then a man named Joseph Guillotine, an opponent of the death penalty funnily enough, proposed that instead of using a man to do the job, they should build a machine to do it instead. He went before the Assembly, which was essentially France's new government after the revolution, and proposed to them that they could decapitate criminals by the effect of a simple mechanism. The Assembly were not convinced, and Guillotine doubled down on the virtues of doing things his way. He joked that, "With my machine, I'll have your head off in the blink of an eye." The Assembly burst out laughing and shooed Guillotine out of the room. His idea had failed to convince them. But how little did they know that within a decade, so many of those men laughing at him would find themselves uttering their final words as they were fed into his machine, the guillotine. Not only this, but the general public found the idea that you could use a machine to behead someone, quite frankly, ridiculous and a bit too soft and woke. Little songs were made up mocking Guillotine, and one of those songs featured the word guillotine, or little guillotine, which is where we have our name for the device, guillotine. However, the Assembly didn't have a better idea about how to carry out these one-size-fits-all executions, but luckily they were able to call in a man of experience, the High Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, the same man who, when he was just 18 years old, had tortured and killed Damiens in 1757. Sanson, who was now in his 50s, explained that Guillotine was right and that a machine would be the only way they could dish out a standardised death sentence, as human error was all too common with traditional beheading methods. After Sanson's clear advice, the Assembly swallowed their pride and approached Guillotine to ask him if he'd like to make this new machine for them after all, and get filthy rich in the process. Guillotine, however, was so upset by the public jokes, the songs, and the Assembly laughing at his face that he flat out refused and told them to go and find someone else to make it. It's often said that the way Guillotine died is by his own creation, the guillotine, but this is actually wrong on both accounts. He died of natural causes, and he never actually made the guillotine, he just suggested one. The guys who actually made it were working under the supervision of the physician Antoine Louis, and a man named Lacroyant designed the first prototype, which was then constructed by a German harpsichord maker named Tobias Schmidt. Unfortunately, for everyone involved though, the name guillotine, from the little joke songs on the street, had stuck. By late 1791, Sanson and his crew were testing out the first prototype on corpses and animals to make sure it was effective and consistent as they had been promised. And it was. It must be said that there were other forms of beheading devices that had already existed before this version, like the Halifax gibbet or the maiden, but this new guillotine came with plenty of its own innovations that made it perfect for mass, almost industrialised killing. The blade, with its angular rather than flat edge, allowed for a larger cutting surface overall, but a smaller initial point of contact upon impact, meaning that less force would be required to deliver a clean cut every time. For good measure though, a weight was fixed to the top to ensure enough power was delivered, no matter the size or girth of the victim's neck. The guillotine left nothing to chance, and as we now know, it claimed its first victim on the 25th of April 1792, Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, although the crowd wasn't as impressed as the Assembly had been. But it was humane, it was quick, it was convenient, it made execution relatively cheap, and it was novel and interesting, even if not as fun as the traditional methods. Quick, convenient, cheap, interesting. Not good things you want in ways to kill people. And as the French Revolution started to enter its bloodiest chapter, the guillotine would take centre stage. In fact, during the Terror between June 1793 and July 1794, just over a year-long period, around 17,000 people had been sent to the guillotine. And sometimes in mass dispatches, dozens at a time were rounded up and killed. At one point, they'd gotten things so efficient that they were able to kill 12 people in a single minute with just one machine. And that's one of the things that makes the guillotine so much worse than you think. Because it's easy to point to cases like Damien, who had one of the worst deaths in history, and then look at the guillotine and think, that looks pretty painless and humane and fast, and as execution methods go, it's not that bad. But because it was humane and painless and fast and convenient, it was just so much easier to send people to the guillotine en masse, making it even more likely that you'd be executed for the smallest of things, or sometimes just for being suspected of doing something, even if there wasn't any proof. And during the Terror of the French Revolution, this was very, very normal. In fact, it almost became a part of daily life, with the guillotine turning out an average of 50 heads per day. And with all this spectacle came the crowds. See, although it was originally seen as kind of boring compared to the old ways, these new en masse executions were suddenly fun again. Vendors sold pamphlets that showed the list of each day's condemned, and it wasn't uncommon for people to enjoy a drink or a bite to eat as they watched the business of those weighted blades drop down from the sky on their petrified victims. It was also politically popular. The guillotine came to symbolise the revolutionary ideals of equality before law and equality in death. It wasn't lost on anyone that when King Louis XVI was executed in September of 1792, he was beheaded with the guillotine, just like every other criminal who was executed that year, including the lowly robber Pelletier. Interesting tidbit, the guy that killed Louis was, you guessed, none other than our lovable executioner throughout this whole video, Sanson. Guillotine mania got so bad, in fact, that at one point they had to put up a protective barrier between the scaffold and the crowd because they were putting so many people through the machine that blood was starting to splatter and run down into the crowds in streams. To the public, the guillotine started to become the object of increasingly dark jokes throughout its use. People laughed that the guillotine cured your headache, it stopped your hair greying, it kept you pale, which was a beauty standard at the time. It was the nation's razor, or the patriotic shortener. The more it was used, the more this gallows humour took hold, but not everyone was laughing. Some physicians had begun to notice that the heads rolling off this assembly line of death were still looking very much alive. When Charlotte Corday was executed with the guillotine in 1793, her executioner picked up her head out of the basket and allowed spectators to give her a slap. They noticed that her cheeks turned red, as though she were blushing from the embarrassment of it all. 2 years later, in 1795, the physician Samuel Thomas von Sommering argued that people may still be conscious and active of mind for quite some time after decapitation, perhaps as long as 15 minutes, meaning that the guillotine was not in fact painless or fast, but quite an agonising torture in which the victim is aware of their death but left unable to express themselves. He stated that the grinding of teeth, the twitching of muscles, and the expression in the eyes gave him the impression that if air still circulated through the organs of the voice, the heads would speak. Much later, in 1905, a physician named Gabriel Barriou was present for the execution by guillotine of a man named Henri Languille. He wrote of the ordeal, "Immediately after decapitation, the eyelids and lips held irregular contractions for 5 or 6 seconds. I waited for the movements in his face to cease, and then with a strong, sharp voice shouted his name, 'Languille!' I saw the eyelids slowly lift up, with a movement quite normal, like when one is awakened or interrupted from a deep thought. Then he fixed his eyes on mine, and his pupils focused themselves. It was not a vague, expressionless look, but living eyes which were looking at me. After several seconds, the eyelids closed again and I called out again. Once more, his eyes lifted and fixed themselves on mine more intensely than the first time. Then, a partial closing of the eyes and a glazed look like any other dead man. I called his name a third time, but received no response. It's still up for debate today whether or not one's head survives after decapitation by guillotine, but one thing that's not up for debate is that by the 20th century it became less and less publicly popular, and eventually was seen as unethical. In 1957, the French philosopher Albert Camus wrote against the death penalty in general, but zeroed in on the guillotine in particular because it was especially inhumane by virtue of its mechanical effectiveness, which leaves the victim powerless and hopeless. Whereas those being hanged could hope that the knot slips and they survive the whole ordeal, when someone is about to be guillotined, they, quote, have only one thought, that the machine will function properly. In 1977, the same year as the release of Saturday Night Fever, France performed its last ever execution by guillotine, beheading a man named Hamida Jandoubi, who was facing a death sentence for kidnapping, torturing and murdering the 21-year-old Elizabeth Bosquet. So, some justice in the end. It's sometime in early June 53 BC. The Roman general Marcus Crassus and his army are holed up in the town of Carrhae in modern-day Turkey. Crassus has been on a campaign to try and invade Rome's eastern rival, the Parthian Empire, but it hasn't been going well. To some extent, it's already over. Crassus doesn't know it yet, but his days are numbered. See, Crassus isn't really a statesman or a general. Instead, he gets his power from his enormous wealth. By some accounts, he's the richest man in Rome. But soon, this wealthy general will be forced to swallow his pride. Quite literally, in the form of molten gold. On the 9th of June, Crassus had an enormous army of 40,000 men confidently marching through Parthian territory. But by the next day, the 10th, he's left with just 10,000 soldiers, heavily injured, undersupplied, and exhausted, holed up in a small town just over the Parthian border. He'd lost his men at the Battle of Carrhae, where the vastly outnumbered Parthian cavalry was able to pin down the Romans under a constant barrage of arrows slung from horseback. To break the deadlock, Crassus sent his son Publius out on a cavalry charge to try and disrupt the Parthian line and cut a way out of the trap that had them surrounded. But all of those sent out would be slaughtered. Later in the day, Crassus would see his own son again when a Parthian horseman started riding up and down the Roman line, holding a spear with Publius's severed head impaled on the point. At this sight, Crassus broke down and the Roman army was left without effective command for the rest of the battle. Luckily for them, however, the sun was just beginning to set and the Parthians had strict rules against fighting during nighttime. With the Parthian onslaught relenting, the battered Roman army began to take up a defensive position. Crassus himself remained broken at the loss of his son and was unable to pull himself together and lead his men. Eventually, his subordinates took control and a desperate retreat through the desert to the town of Carrhae was ordered. In order to escape the Parthian army, this march back to safety would need to begin immediately in the dead of night. Things were so grim that the Romans had to leave behind 4,000 of their men, nearly 10% of the entire force, just because they were too injured to make the march through the desert. And as for those who had the strength to walk, the march itself was an utter disaster, with another 2,000 men getting outright lost in the middle of the Black Night. And on top of all this, the Parthian army was hot on the tail of the survivors, picking up the trail at dawn and hacking down any stragglers who fell behind. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and for Crassus personally, it was about to get much, much worse, even if he had effectively given up all control. Once the 10,000 survivors reached Carrhae, the Parthian general named Serena came to negotiate. The Romans would be allowed to leave in peace, but only if they signed a treaty promising never again to invade Parthia. Crassus, devastated at the loss of his son, humiliated at the embarrassing conduct during the battle, and desperate to try and avoid any personal blame for the catastrophe, outright refused to negotiate with General Serena. But when his men threatened him with mutiny if he refused to comply, Crassus was forced to go out and meet the man that had crushed his army and killed his son. Serena then proceeded to humiliate Crassus by forcing him to mount a horse covered almost completely in gold. This would have been outrageously expensive by the standards of the time, and the point was to poke fun of Crassus's wealth. Anyway, after Crassus mounted the horse, one of Serena's men started whipping and taunting the beast, so that Crassus was forced to hold as the mare kicked and thrashed in terror. Eventually, Crassus's guards intervened, and a melee broke out between the Roman and Parthian bodyguards. The Parthians won, and his bodyguards were cut down. Crassus was thrown from the horse, his hand was hacked off, and as a final punishment for his invasion of Parthia, Serena had a fitting end. The Roman general was held down, and once his mouth was pried open, one of the Parthians poured molten gold directly into his mouth and down his throat. His cries of anguish and pain would quickly turn to gurgles as his lungs tried to scream through the 1000 degrees Celsius metal, which was now working its way into his entrails. The Roman general burned alive from the inside out. It was through his enormous wealth that he was able to invade Parthia, and it would be this wealth that he was forced to swallow. Well, that's the story. Anyway, historians today debate whether or not that last bit actually happened, with some saying he may have been just beheaded before the molten gold was poured into his body, and others saying that the molten gold thing didn't happen at all. But before you breathe a big sigh of relief, I have another case of a Roman general being forced to drink molten gold, and this one definitely happened. The story begins with the Roman politician Manius Aquilius becoming ambassador to Asia Minor in 90 BC, about 40 years before the story of Crassus, and not too far away geographically either, also being in modern-day Turkey. And don't worry, this story is a lot shorter than Crassus's, so we'll be right back to the molten gold in a minute or less. So, Aquilius was sent to Asia Minor to try and restore Nicomedes to power after he had been ousted by Mithridates VI. Although originally successful, Aquilius and Nicomedes then marched into Mithridates' territory. This went badly. Manius Aquilius was forced to flee Asia Minor, but before long he was caught and delivered to Mithridates personally, who was determined to make an example out of anyone trying to undermine his authority. There was also some bad blood to settle, since Aquilius' father had previously been the governor around the region and was hated by the local people as an extractive and greedy ruler who made himself monstrously rich at the expense of the surrounding population. After some failed negotiations and appeals to free Aquilius, Mithridates had him sentenced to execution, and the method would be a reflection of his greed and ambition. In the words of the historian Appian, Mithridates made a spectacle of him in chains. Finally, he poured molten gold into his mouth to mock his greed. Of course, many of you by now are wondering how this would actually feel for the victim, and the ancient sources don't tell us much. But I have done my best to put some research together for you, and luckily for us, there was actually some experiments by Dutch scientists in 2013 where they poured superheated lead into a cow's larynx to see what would happen. Don't worry, the cow was already dead. Now, lead of course melts at a far lower temperature than gold, but it's still close enough to get us a picture. So, the bad news is that the victim would not die instantly. The good news is that the victim would probably expire before the gold actually got to their stomach, but a lot has to happen between the gold entering your mouth and the gold settling in your tummy. So, what would it feel like? Well, firstly, the instant that the gold was poured into the mouth, the victim would feel a punishing sizzle as gums, lips, the tongue, and the inside of the cheeks are instantly covered in third-degree burns. Once the gold had worked its way through to the back of the mouth, it would then begin to burn its way downwards, destroying mucous membranes and carbonizing the inside of the throat. At this stage, the victim's screaming would turn to bubbling as the airways become closed by the molten gold. These airways would then swell shut or disintegrate completely, causing the victim to begin asphyxiating. After a few more seconds of this, enough of the soft tissues, saliva, and anything else wet would become exposed to the gold, causing a steam explosion inside the throat and blowing open all of the airways and blood vessels caught in the blast. It's not unlike when you drop wet food into hot oil or leave something in the microwave for too long, except, instead of a TV lasagna, it's someone's actual larynx. Death could occur in any number of ways, either from straight-up suffocation, respiratory failure from shock, or blood loss as major arteries are burned open, or straight up blown out in the steam explosion. It would be an unthinkable way to die as you feel the 1,000 degree gold working its way through your throat as you're left unable to scream. Death would most likely occur within 10 to 20 seconds from the gold entering the mouth. But for those forced to watch the affair, the show would still go on as the body would snap, crackle, and pop with more steam explosions, and smouldering gold began to burn its way through the torso and the rest of the face. But here's another grim thing to ponder. Gold was extremely valuable in the ancient world. Let's remember that the reason this execution method was used on Aquilius was to mock his greed and make an example of those seeking to enrich themselves at Mithridates' expense. But Mithridates, let's not forget, had a war on the go and soldiers need paying. The gold in Aquilius's smoking body would probably be enough to pay a soldier's wages for a considerable period of time. All of this means that the day after the execution, someone would have the unfortunate job of picking through his corpse to retrieve the precious metal. At the Swiss Arts Awards, someone submitted a piece called The Death of Marcus Crassus in 2006, and it looks like this, showing the molten gold perfectly set inside the lining of the organs. But the reality would be a much messier, much more explosive affair. Although some of the gold may have managed to set inside the lining of the lower organs, everything from the throat up would be unrecognisable, and those tasked with extracting the gold would have probably had to pick through the body chunk by carbonised chunk in order to peel off whatever gold had managed to stick to flesh and set there. When the Dutch scientists poured molten lead into the cow's larynx, they found the lead had set into a perfect mould of the cow's throat, which is what you're looking at right now. But let's remember, cows are a lot bigger than people, and lead melts at about 300 degrees Celsius, unlike gold, which needs around 1,000. So it's reasonable to assume that this clean set would not be the case for Aquilius or Crassus. There was also another Roman who supposedly suffered this fate, this time an emperor named Valerian, who was subjected to this end after being taken captive by the king of Iran, Sapor I. Valerian was forced to undergo all manner of insults and indignities during his time in captivity, even being used as a human footstool whenever Sapor mounted his horse. After some time of this, Valerian offered Sapor a king's ransom if he would set him free, and in exchange, Sapor forced Valerian to swallow molten gold to make an example of him. No negotiations here, although it must be said, other historical sources state that Valerian was in fact flayed instead. A video on that to come shortly, by the way. But back to swallowing molten metal. See, during the research for this video, I came across a really bizarre case of this happening as late as the 18th century. And I read the account in order to, get an idea of what would actually happen if someone went through this. Now, it's not an emperor being forced to drink molten gold, but the story's just too bizarre and too interesting not to share. So, in 1755, a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall was on duty at a lighthouse in southern England when at about 2 a.m. a fire suddenly erupted inside the building. Hall and his colleagues rushed to extinguish the fire, but after continually failing to stop the blaze, they realised the fire was coming from the top of the lighthouse. Hall looked up at the roof above him at just the moment that molten lead started to leak into the floor below, peppering his face with the 300-degree metal. This predictably made him scream, and at this moment, another droplet of lead managed to fall directly into his mouth, and without stopping to think, he swallowed the molten lead. He then screamed to his colleagues, "My God, I'm on fire inside." But despite this 94-year-old man, now mutilated and apparently full of molten lead, continues to fight the fire with the others until they were eventually forced to abandon the structure. Then, 5 days later, a passing ship took Henry Hall to the town of Plymouth, where he promptly reported to a local doctor named Henry Spry. When he told the doctor what happened, Spry assumed that the old man had just lost his marbles after all of this trauma and the burns to his face, and brushed the story aside as just, crazy old man talk. Spry would wrote in his diary that Henry Hall was 94 years old, of good constitution, and extremely active for one of that age. Hall was also able to eat food, drink water, and swallow medicine, so to Spry all seemed well. There was no way he had swallowed molten lead, which was good news for the chirpy old man. But by the 6th day in Spry's care, Hall started to decline, and later that same day, Spry would write that he observed Hall being seized with cold sweat and spasms of the tendons. And with this, he soon expired. With his patient dead, Spry realised he could now find out for good if the old boy was lying about his meal of molten lead, and quickly performed an autopsy. When he cut Hal's torso open, he found the lining of his throat extremely burned and inflamed, and finally, when cutting into his stomach, he found a 7-ounce blob of solidified lead, which he then drew an outline of, which we can see here. So, after all, maybe those Roman generals felt a bit more than just 10 seconds of agony. In the summer of 1716, Captain Henry Boyd set sail from the port of Gibraltar to the Italian coastal town of Livorno. Aboard his merchant ship would have been textiles, muskets, tobacco and sugar from the Americas, expensive stuff. But he won't make the journey. Once outside the protection of port, disaster strikes, as a nightmare made flesh slowly edges over the horizon. Barbary pirates from the coast of Algeria. For Captain Henry Boyd, it's a terrifying sight. He knows these marauders aren't going to risk a fight just for textiles or sugar. Instead, the Barbary pirates are renowned for a very particular kind of plunder. Human slaves. Too far from port to expect help from the Royal Navy, Boyd and his crew set up and dig in for the fight of their lives. We don't have any records on how the battle went down, but we know that Henry and his crew lost because Henry Boyd spent the next 20 years as a slave in Algeria. It was while he came to port in the city of Algiers as a captive slave that he saw what is quite possibly the most brutal punishment of our past. The hooks. A method of execution so savagely cruel and violent that it seems to have been almost completely wiped from history. Almost. Some records do remain, however. And on paper, it's a simple process. For the victim, though, it's a savage death. Those who were sentenced to this fate would be forced to stand on top of the city walls and then pushed to fall to their death below. But they won't be smashed against the rock, they won't drown in the sea. That's too easy. Instead, the wall would be studded with a series of meat hooks, arranged in different angles, at different heights, and in all different sizes. Once the victim is shoved over the edge, they fall unpredictably on the hooks. Limbs and torsos are pierced at random, leaving the victim dangling in agonizing positions, left to bake for days in the punishing Algerian sun. Some victims have limbs torn from their bodies as they smash onto the hooks with violent force before being caught later again in their fall. The hooks bite into whatever they can find, sinking into soft flesh under the armpits, snagging the meat between the ribs, or smashing through ankles. If a victim is lucky, the hook could strike their head and end their suffering instantly, though no records remain that speak of a victim who didn't suffer for at least hours or days after being dropped. It's not unlike those old arcane coin pushing machines where you watch the penny dodge and bounce between pegs on the way down to determine your prize. It's that same level of unpredictability, just swap out the pegs for meat hooks and the pennies for human souls. Captain Henry Boyd sees this cruel punishment inflicted to another slave in the city of Algiers, a fellow Christian taken prisoner for slavery who resisted his captors by trying to kill his new owner. For the crime of disobedience, this Christian slave was sentenced to perish on the hooks. Well, that's the story. Anyway, the reality is that Captain Henry Boyd was never taken as a slave by the Barbary pirates, and he might not have existed at all. Many historians today believe that his book, A Journal of the Captivity of Henry Boyd, is actually a plagiarized translation of another book written by a French priest named Jean-Baptiste de la Salle, who travelled to Algeria in the late 1600s to try and arrange the release of Christian slaves taken captive by the pirates. But even though Henry Boyd's story might not be totally true, the Barbary pirates and their slave trade was real, and so was that nightmarish punishment for disobedience, the hooks. By the 16th century, with Spanish and Portuguese naval power declining in the Mediterranean, a new opportunity for piracy and plunder was ripe for the plucking. It was this background that allowed the Barbary pirates, operating from the coast of North Africa, to become an enormous threat in the region. Between the 16th to the 19th century, up to 1 million Europeans were kidnapped and taken to be sold as slaves in North Africa. At some point, the pirates got so confident that they went from poaching isolated ships on the Mediterranean to conducting coastal raids on European land. In 1631, the pirates got as far north as Ireland, where they plundered and kidnapped the entire population of the village of Baltimore in one single raid. Of the some 200 people that were taken prisoner, only 2 ever managed to return home. The rest lived out the remainder of their days as slaves. Conditions were grim. Women were forced to do domestic labour, and of course, like so many women slaves of the past, there was often a fate of forced intimacy with the owners. For men, conditions varied. Anyone with a skill like shipmaking or a decent education would have been employed to perform those same jobs as they did before, just now under duress. But for men with little to no skills, one of the worst fates imaginable waited for them: to become oarmen. These poor souls would be chained to a seat at the bottom of a ship and would have their hands tied to oars. From then onwards, they would row forever until they died. These slaves would never leave their seat under the deck, not even for a moment. They would eat, sleep, and go to the bathroom where they sat, leading to awful hygiene, infections, and a never-ending routine of death. For the Barbary pirates, though, slaves were never in short supply, so the death of an oarsman was easier to deal with than the risk of briefly unchaining the men so that they could clean themselves, which carried the chance of the slaves attempting a mutiny. This meant, of course, that if a ship went down, the oarsmen who were chained to the boat would go down with her. It is an unimaginably grim fate to ponder, but for those who showed disobedience, something worse still awaited: those hooks on the city walls. In the 1720s, another Englishman, this time named Thomas Shaw, went to the port of Algiers, and there he saw the hooks in use. He said, quote, "Over the battlements of the city walls they are thrown upon the hooks that are fixed all over the walls below, where sometimes they break from one hook to another and hang in the most exquisite torments, 30 or 40 hours. In 1596, around 130 years before Thomas Shaw writes about the hooks, another man named William Davies recalls his experience of watching those unfortunate souls forced to drop onto the hooked teeth below. "He sitteth upon a wall. Right under the place where he sits is a strong iron hook, fastened, being very sharp. Then he is thrust off the wall upon this hook, with some part of his body, and there he hangeth, sometimes 2 or 3 days, before he dieth." Like all savage forms of public execution that we've covered on this channel, it's all about sending a message to the population. Break the rules, and this is how it ends. For the European slaves kept captive in Algiers, the hooks serve as a constant reminder to swallow your pride, keep your head down, and abandon hope. The hooks would continue to be a staple method of punishment in Algeria until the French conquest of Algiers in 1830 and the rise of European colonialism in Africa, which put a stop to many of these brutal practices. Colonialism would, of course, come with its own cruelties and injustices, but that's a subject for another day. Today was about the hooks, which, I would argue, is the worst punishment that you'd never heard of. It's sometime in late September of 1705. We're in North Africa, and a man named Melek is found guilty of plotting a rebellion against Moulay Ismail, the Sultan of Morocco. Melek is a local governor, also known as an alcaide, but his rank won't save him, and although the leader of this rebellion was none other than the Sultan's own son, Moulay Mohammed, Alcaide Melek has been a busy boy. According to the Sultan's wife, Mr. Melek had taken advantage of the chaos and had beheaded a man named Bukasra, the cousin of the Sultan. All this was very serious stuff, and naturally, the Sultan was incensed to find a punishment brutal enough to fit the crime and send a message to anyone else who feels like stepping out of line. The Sultan takes his time coming up with a fitting execution method. By October that year, he finally has an idea. He sends for his carpenter and asks the tradesman if he has any saws in his collection that would be capable of sawing a man in two. The carpenter responds with a yes, and Sultan Moulay has his method. He sends the carpenter away, along with the sons of Bukasra, the man that Melek had beheaded, and tells them to select the tools they need for the job, and then collect Melek himself from his cell. Meanwhile, the Sultan had gathered a crowd of some 4,000 spectators, most of which made up of Melek's supporters and family, and then he had his prisoner escorted to the execution site on the back of a mule. Once he arrived at the site, the crowd had already worked themselves up into a bit of a mess. Many of them knew Melek personally and were supportive of his actions so far. The audience were crying, screaming and clawing at their faces with grief as they saw their governor slowly making his way towards his end. Melek, on the other hand, who doesn't yet know the method of his execution, is reported to have been almost completely unperturbed by the whole affair, and it's said that he was calmly enjoying a smoke from his tobacco pipe as he inched towards his death. Once he arrived at the square, he was strapped to a board with his arms and legs fastened outwards, and then once secured, he was placed upon a saw bench and shown the large tools that were intended to be the means of his end. It is said that once he felt the teeth of the saw touch his skull, his composure broke, and he began screaming and straining against the restraints in order to try and avoid this unimaginable fate, as the saw teeth first found purchase in the hair, which would be torn out with each stroke, before the scalp became ground down in the teeth, and finally, the skull itself would be ground down, stroke by stroke. However, for Melek, it must have seemed as though fate intervened, and his begging and pleading, as well as the commotion of the crowd, had forced the Sultan to reconsider this extreme act of cruelty. He heard a voice amongst the executioners ring out, and a short conversation between the Sultan and his team ensued. The saw was then taken away before it had so much as even harmed a hair on Melek's head. But unfortunately, this was no act of mercy. The conversation had actually been between the Sultan and the sons of Bukasra, the man that Melek had beheaded, and they had intervened to complain that starting the process at the head would result in a death that was far too easy, and they insisted that the sawing instead begin between the legs to maximise the suffering. With this, Melek's wave of relief was suddenly dashed into a crescendo of horror as he was turned upside down, and then the saw was reapplied to his body, this time not at the top of the head, but between the legs and in the groin. With this act, the method met with everybody's approval, and the executioners were given permission to begin their work. A regular carpentry job, taken to its cruelest possible incarnation. With one man standing at either side of Melek, each one holding an end of the saw, they began to push and pull the blade towards and away from one another, dragging the teeth of the saw across whatever piece of Melek the teeth were able to first latch onto. With each shove of the blade, the saw sank slightly deeper, the cries grew more desperate, and the crowd began to cover their eyes to avoid seeing the horrific display. After tearing into the delicate flesh around that very sensitive area, the teeth of the saw would have effortlessly torn through the muscle, fat, and skin, until finally embedding itself into the bone, which would create a sound not unlike that of wood under a saw. A shunk, shunk would have echoed across the square, intermingled with desperate screams of agony and hopeless cries for mercy. To quote an eyewitness, chunks of flesh were ripped out by the saw's teeth, causing blood to splatter everywhere, thus making the execution quite unbearable to watch. Once the saw had managed to grind its way through the pelvis, it would then follow the spinal column, causing unimaginable pain as the large concentration of nerves are torn away from the flesh and bone. And then finally, as the stomach begins to open, large parts of the digestive tract come loose and dangle down onto the victim. Let us not forget that saws don't work by cutting and slicing the flesh like a sword or an axe would, but instead they work by creating a countless series of tears, one on top of the other, one tooth at a time, which collectively carve out a path through the victim. For Melek, who would now have his face caked in his own blood and entrails, death should have been imminent, with most executions by sawing ending once the blade reaches the chest cavity and begins to obliterate the heart and lungs. Unfortunately for him, however, the spite of his executioners would know no bounds, and it's reported that once the teeth of the blade rested at his belly button, the sawmen were instructed to stop immediately and leave the wretch to hang and suffer for a while longer. Melek, who was still conscious at this time, is reported to have requested a glass of water by this stage, but was predictably refused. After it was deemed that he had suffered enough, the saw was removed and then placed underneath Melek's head so that they could begin to saw from the other direction until they met the previous incision, which would effectively split the man in two. Within a few strokes of the sawing to the head, Melek finally expired, but the horror show wasn't over. Around 300 other co-conspirators were impaled alive, and some 20 people who were accused of lesser betrayals also got a taste of the saw, although they were fortunate, if you can call it that, to have just individual limbs amputated, rather than be completely sawn in half. Brutal as this method of execution is, though, it's not unique to Morocco or the 18th century. The Roman Emperor Caligula was said to be extremely fond of sawing his victims in two, and would often put on this depraved display during meal times, supposedly in order to entertain his guests and set the tone for the meal. Imperial China was also renowned for its creative use of punishments, especially by sawing, although typically they would saw through the victims horizontally, across the torsos, rather than vertically through them, which would typically be less painful and would result in a much faster death for the victim. Several early Christian martyrs are also said to have perished by the saw, perhaps most famously being Simon the Zealot, who was sawn in half in a way similar to Melek, as can be seen in this illustration by Lucas Cranach. And then as late as the 19th century, during the incredibly brutal events of the Hungarian Revolution, some 4,000 Serbs committed some pretty awful crimes against the Hungarian civilian populace, including executions by fire and, predictably, lots of people being sawn in two. So, in all reality, this brutal method of execution was probably invented about 10 minutes after the saw itself was invented, and we can only hope that in our modern world we can continue to keep the saw's use for practical and building purposes, and for the love of God, steer clear of using this tool on other people. In the meantime, try not to upset any carpenters. In the year 1609, a Catholic Frenchman named François Ravaillac is awoken at night by a series of religious visions, and as a result, he comes to believe that he's on a mission from God to persuade the French King Henry IV to forcefully convert France's Protestant Huguenots into Catholics. Although these visions may have seemed divinely ordained, they won't end well for Ravaillac, and a series of events are now set in motion which will result in one of the most unimaginable tortures possible, something called the boots, a tool which crushes, tears, cripples and obliterates the delicate muscles and bones inside the foot until the victim is unable to walk ever again. But grim as these boots are, and we'll soon cover them in much more detail, his ultimate fate will be far worse. Between late 1609 and 1610, Ravaillac made 3 separate trips to Paris, each time determined to get an audience with His Majesty in order to try and share his divine vision and get Henry IV to crack down on the Protestants within France. But try as he might, Ravaillac is unable to actually meet with his king, and this failure drives him deeper into madness. He interprets Henry's unwillingness to meet with him as proof that the king is actually his enemy, and when a war breaks out between France and Catholic Spain, Ravaillac has all the evidence he needs to satisfy his mind that the French king is no friend to Catholics. Since Ravaillac is unable to get the king to listen to reason, there's only one option left. He'll have to take matters into his own hands, and it doesn't take long for Mr. Ravaillac to get his chance. On the 14th of May 1610, he lays in wait as the king's carriage passes through the Rue de la Ferronnerie in Paris, and to his amazement, the carriage is forced to halt due to an unexpected blockage in the street. He takes it as another message, that this blockage is nothing other than a sign from God, that Ravaillac is to take care of the king personally. Whilst the royal attendants attempt to clear a path through the street, Ravaillac makes a dash towards the static cabin, hops over the wheel of the carriage, and just like that, he's inside the king's chamber. But he hasn't just bought words. Instead, this time he brandishes a dagger, which he quickly plunges into the torso of the defenceless king. To quote the chronicler Père de l'Osteya, Ravaillac climbed on the wheel of the coach and with a knife trenchant on both sides, stabbed the king between the 2nd and 3rd ribs. Ravaillac was immediately arrested, and fearing that the Parisian mob may try and lynch him on the spot, he's whisked away to the conciergerie, a large courthouse where they can properly deal with him. According to the court records, when Ravaillac was questioned about his guilt, he immediately confessed, saying, "I know very well he is dead. I saw the blood on my knife and the place where I hit him. But I have no regrets at all about dying, because I've done what I came to do." This assassin was now about to face the most brutal of recriminations, as the French authorities scrambled to try and discover whether or not there were any more accomplices in the conspiracy. Although he swore that he was acting alone, his captors were not convinced, and so it was decided that he be subjected to torture in order to loosen his tongue. It was ordered that he be tortured by a form of the boots, and in the case of Ravaillac, it was a particularly nasty contraption known as the brodequin. It's essentially just a 3-sided box designed to fit snugly around the victim's legs, at which point ropes were used to tighten the whole thing into the wooden casing so that the victim couldn't move and their lower legs were under excruciating pressure. With this, the torturer would place a wedge of wood between the knees of the victim and then drive the wedges home with a hammer, forcing the wood between the tightly bound legs, scraping away flesh and skin, before they're finally driven all the way down, resting between the ankle balls of the victim. This would obviously create a crushing sensation, as the tightly bound legs are forced to accommodate a block of wood inside the brodequin and the extreme pressure. This was after just one wedge had been driven home, and for serious crimes, up to 8 wedges could be used on the victim, which would essentially render the legs unrecognisable and, of course, unusable. I don't need to emphasise the incredible pain that this would cause for the victim, as the wedges are driven into the ultrafine gap between the legs, so tightly bound that the torture hand must use a 2-handed hammer in order to drive them downwards. Ravaillac was able to endure the first wedge without much complaint, but as his captors placed the second wedge between his kneecaps, he began to break his composure. The mallet came down nonetheless, and a sickening crack within the legs would have echoed through the chamber as the blood pooled at his feet, and the knees and ankles started to be dislocated and crushed out of place. As the mallet was risen up once more to drive the second wedge home, Ravaillac screamed to his captors, "I am a sinner, but I know no more than I have declared. By the truth I owe to God and the court. All I can say, I have already declared. I beseech the court not to drive my soul into despair." The torture, however, continued, and Ravaillac was unable to name any fellow conspirators, probably because he had been acting alone. By the 3rd or 4th wedge, the kneecap itself would be entirely dislocated, the muscle, fat and skin of the shins would have been almost completely stripped away, and the tibia and fibula would have been utterly destroyed, causing bone marrow to ooze down his feet. The ankle ball itself also would be completely crushed under the blunt trauma and agonising pressure within the brodequin. Nonetheless, Ravaillac remained resolute, and in the end, the court decided that no further torture should be used. He never named another accomplice, and it was deemed that he would be executed on the 27th of May 1610, around 2 weeks after his arrest. The injuries he sustained during his interrogation were so extreme that when he was finally put to death, he was unable to walk even a step towards his execution site and was instead carried to the gallows. There he would be hanged, drawn and quartered, which is described by the historian Alistair Horn in the following words. Before being drawn and quartered, he was scalded with burning sulphur, molten lead and boiling oil and resin, his flesh then being torn by pincers. So Ravaillac had certainly paid for his attempt on the king's life, and although his story was over, the story of the boots would continue. Around 150 years later, another Frenchman determined to kill their king, this time a man named Robert Francois Damiens, was also executed in much the same way, and during his ordeal, another form of the boots was used, this time though not as part of the interrogation, but instead as part of the punishment itself, for no reason other than to inflict further suffering. In Damiens' case, instead of having his legs tied together inside a brodequin, he had individual feet inserted into cast iron boots, at which point the same process of wedging was employed, driving down chunks of wood into the gap between the leg and the inside of the boot, utterly crushing the shin and foot within until blood and bone marrow began to ooze out of the top of the boot. We're not sure about the case of Damiens specifically, but in some cases, the boot itself would be applied while it was red hot, searing the flesh before the crushing began, and inflaming the dermis around the area, allowing for the wedges to effectively glove the skin off the foot completely. Like Ravaillac, Damiens was also tormented with sulphur, picked at with red-hot pincers, and finally hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the boots weren't unique to France, or to this time period. One particularly grim incarnation comes as early as 10th century Scotland, although the process here was a bit different. Instead of crushing the foot inside a case with wedges, the foot and lower leg would instead be wrapped tightly with wet rawhide before being placed over a gentle fire. As the rawhide dries up and gets hot, it contracts rapidly and aggressively, causing the tight-fitting garment over the foot to squeeze with incredible force. There are 26 bones in the human foot, including a clump of floating bones behind the metatarsals. This extreme pressure would cause the shape of the foot to crush, squeezing out the loose bones with a pop, like bread jumping from a toaster. Permanent disfigurement would be an expected consequence, as the bones of the foot fuse themselves back together in this unnatural position. As if this didn't sound bad enough, it's also worth considering that there's a large concentration of nerves between the metatarsals, meaning that any pressure which squeezes these bones together could easily result in nerve impingement, as the sensitive pain receptors are ground between the crushed bones. This, by the way, happens often to cyclists today and is known as hot foot, where the pressure and shape of the bicycle pedal causes the bones within the foot to squeeze together and pinch the nerves between them. Hot foot is of course an extremely painful condition to endure, and I'll let you imagine the torment when it's taken to its absolute limit, as the rawhide contracts around a foot with the force to dislocate entire sections of the skeletal structure. Of course, this wouldn't kill you by design, the point was to inflict pain, but in the long term, it could certainly be dangerous, since the crushing process could easily inflict damage onto the blood supply to the foot, and because feet spend lots of time inside shoes or getting dirty, infection was a common after effect, and the development of gangrene could often mean death, or at the very least, total amputation. Brutal as this is, though, it's a form of torture that can be seen more or less everywhere at some point. In India, a version of the boots consisted of nothing more than 2 boards strapped to either side of a victim's foot before being gradually tightened, first completely obliterating the ankle and then finally crushing inwards until the entire foot is ground to pulp. Again, in Imperial China, you have jiagun, another crushing process by which the feet are placed between boards of wood which are progressively tightened until the feet are crushed and unusable. But don't be thinking the boots are just about crushing. Human cruelty and creativity would know no bounds, and there's another kind of torture for the feet hailing from Autun in eastern France, in which boots are made from a spongy, porous leather and then drawn over the victim's feet and legs before boiling water was poured over those boots, eventually soaking through the leather and eating into the legs and feet of the victim forced to wear them. Another variation is to physically weld a pair of metal boots onto a sturdy floor and then force a prisoner to either stand or sit in them and then restrain them so they cannot withdraw their feet. Then, once they're locked in within their metal cases, boiling water could be poured into the boots, steaming the feet within. For particularly heinous crimes, or if the torture master had exhausted his patience, the water could be replaced instead with boiling fat, which would immediately hit the foot with a punishing sizzle before proceeding to completely fry the flesh trapped within. In any case, victims who underwent this kind of torture would never properly recover and would be left permanently disfigured as a result of the punishment. Sometimes this was the point, in order to send a message to others who are considering stepping out of line, but oftentimes it was pointless suffering, designed to extract information that didn't exist, such as the case of Francois Ravaillac, who endured the most unimaginable crushing, only for the authorities to change their mind and have him tortured to death anyway. This frenzy of crushing and frying would eventually subsist over the 18th century, and by the 19th century most European governments more or less abolished judicial torture, although it did occasionally rear its ugly head. The most widespread use of torture to the feet that still exists today is known as bastinado, in which the victim's feet are tied together before being struck multiple times with a cane or a metal rod, which is much more painful than it sounds due to the high concentration of nerves at the base of the feet and the fact that you'd be unable to walk during your recovery. It is still practiced in some parts of the Middle East and Africa today, although thankfully its use is in decline, but it has been known to reappear, particularly during interrogations, when a confession is needed from the victim, and it's sometimes used as a tool of discipline within prisons in order to punish those who step out of line. Sadly, it would seem that for as long as there's a part of the body to hurt and something to hurt it with, us humans will never really change, especially when it can all be licensed under the pretense of justice. In October 401 BC, the King of Kings, Artaxerxes II, stood off against the rebel force led by his own brother, Cyrus the Younger, at the Battle of Cunaxa on the banks of the river Euphrates. The young Cyrus, just 22 years old, had amassed an army of Greek mercenaries around 14,000 strong, with which he hoped to overthrow his older brother and take the throne for himself. In response, Artaxerxes met Cyrus with a number over twice his size, perhaps as many as 40,000 strong. Heavily outnumbered, the battle turns against Cyrus, and in a last-ditch effort to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, the younger brother makes a daring charge directly at Artaxerxes' camp. But Cyrus's moment of valor is suddenly cut short when he's struck with a javelin, which kills him instantly. The man who threw this javelin would go down in history as Mithridates, the man who suffered possibly the worst fate in all of history, a process known today as the boats. But how did this soldier of King Artaxerxes come to find himself subject to this gruesome fate, and what makes the boats so bad? To answer that, we need to pick up where we left off. So, Cyrus the Younger had been slain at the Battle of Cunaxa, and as we know, it was Mithridates who had struck him down. After Cyrus was killed, his rebel forces melted away, and Artaxerxes had been able to successfully put down the uprising and secure his position on the throne. Not only that, but his rival claimant was now dead for good, and he had Mithridates to thank for it. Initially, Artaxerxes was extremely pleased with Mithridates and showered him with gold and promotions for his valiant service. But all of this favour and wealth came on one condition. Mithridates was never to speak aloud that he had killed Cyrus the Younger. The honour of this great deed was to go to King Artaxerxes personally. Unfortunately for Mithridates, his discretion was not as good as his aim, and during the feast to celebrate the battle, he started drunkenly boasting that it was none other than him who had sunk the javelin into Cyrus's chest. This ran directly against the story that King Artaxerxes had told his guests, and as a result, the king was exposed as a liar who had stolen Mithridates' valour. For this act of open disobedience, and for the crime of embarrassing the crown, Mithridates was sentenced to death by Scaism. It was, and perhaps still is, the worst execution method in history, and the process would take not minutes, not hours, not even days. Mithridates' death would take 2.5 weeks to carry out, and each moment would be pure and utter agony. At first, the whole thing actually doesn't sound that bad. In fact, some people have even gone on to call it death by milk and honey, which almost sounds appealing, but as the process unfolds, the horror comes to light. It all begins by taking a small boat and then placing the victim inside so that their hands, feet and head are able to protrude out of the sides, and then an equally sized boat is placed on top, creating a kind of capsule over the body with the extremities dangling outside. Once the victim was properly fastened between the two boats, they wouldn't be able to move, and so they would be stuck in this position for the entirety of the execution, which, let's not forget in Mithridates' case, was 17 days. Now, here's where things get nasty. We're going to quote the Greek historian Plutarch, who covers the process in quite some detail. So, setting them together that the head, hands and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of the body lies shut up within, they then proceed by forcing him to ingest a mixture of milk and honey before pouring all over his face and body. And it's the milk and honey that turned this from a simple case of death by starvation, dehydration or exposure into something absolutely grotesque. You see, milk and honey are extremely rich foods, which means that a small amount can keep someone alive for a pretty long time, and when consumed in abundance can lead to diarrhea and nausea. Of course, to borrow Shakespeare's words, the sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. In other words, this would quickly become a very unpleasant thing to have to consume, and the sources tell us that before long, the victims would have trouble actually keeping this mixture down, to quote Plutarch again. They gave him this food, and if he refused to eat, they forced it down his throat by prying open his mouth with reeds. And again, they would absolutely stuff the victim with so much of this that the victim would become nauseous and their belly would swell with milk and honey. Now, you might be thinking, that's actually not that bad, being force-fed until you die, but trust me, it's about to get so much worse. Once the victim had been fed, that same mixture would then be poured onto the hands, feet and face, meaning that those exposed limbs would begin to attract all manner of insects, flies, wasps, bees and even some nastier stuff we'll get into later. You can imagine the discomfort of having sweet milk and sticky honey slowly harden and bake onto your skin in the punishing heat as you laid on your back under the brutal Persian sun. The 12th century chronicler Zonaras also details the process, and again, to quote him, "This is repeated every day, the effect being that flies, wasps and bees, attracted by the sweetness, settle on his face and all such parts of him as project outside the boats, and miserably torment and sting the wretched man." So, at this stage, the victim is being force-fed milk and honey, and his hands, feet and face are crawling with all manner of creepy crawlies. And yeah, it's unpleasant stuff, but it's not really a worst death in history caliber of suffering. And that's all about to change once we take a look at what's happening inside the boats. Now, remember, the victim is strapped between the two boats and unable to move, which means that when it's time for all of this indulgent grub to come back out, it all ends up inside the boat that you are strapped into whilst laying on your back, essentially turning the whole thing into a septic tank with you inside. And since the victim's diet is just milk and honey, the waste they produce would be abundant, watery, and absolutely stinking as it hotboxes in the 40-degree Persian sun. Plutarch tells us that in the case of Mithridates, this is more or less exactly how things went down. Quote, "Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed." For those who didn't quite catch Plutarch's rather vague language, he's telling us that the conditions inside the boat, which let's not forget are basically a septic tank by now, are absolutely perfect for all kinds of insects and infections to breed like crazy. And that's what kills him. Slowly though, let's remember Mithridates lasts 17 days. Plutarch doesn't actually specify what any of these creeping things and vermin are, but with modern day knowledge we can take a pretty good guess at what exactly would be going down within the boats. See, first you've got open wounds, raw or exposed flesh, and an abundance of feces or urine. Then you've got the constant feeding and the residue of this milk and honey, which causes fermentation and attracts more pests and insects. Zonaras mentions that the stomach itself becomes distended, which basically just means bloated, and on top of all that, you've got no movement within the boats, nor any circulation of fresh air within. So it all starts to kind of rot and decompose as the whole display is left to bake in the sun. To quote Zonaras again, "His belly, distended as it is with milk and honey, throws off liquid excrements, and these putrefying breed swarms of worms, intestinal, and of all sorts." He would have, quite literally, been eaten alive in slow motion from the inside out and from the outside in. And although it was his fellow man who put Mithridates in this position, it would be nature herself that would do the hard lifting. Flesh flies and blowflies would have been first to arrive, attracted by the smell of rotting flesh. These would lay eggs in the open wounds and in the excrement, which would later hatch into maggots. As an interesting side note, modern forensic entomology actually uses these specific types of fly to be able to determine an estimated time of death for corpses. Anyway, these eggs would then hatch as maggots, which would eat through everything they could, and would of course be everywhere. In the mouth, the nose, the ears, the orifices of the body that were within the boats, and any open wounds, and they would also likely be floating around in the slush that was gathering within the chamber. Modern studies show that some maggots can eat through the skin and muscle all the way down to the bone within just days, if given the right conditions. Next up would be ants and beetles, which, like the flies, would be attracted to the smell of decomposing flesh and would be able to do their work on any part of the body softer than bone, stripping away cartilage and fat with ease and entering the body through any available orifice, be that an opening in the flesh or any of the body's pre-existing entry points. Of course, on top of all this, outside of the boats, Mithridates would be constantly bothered by midges, mosquitoes, wasps and bees, all of which attracted by the sight of a free meal, be it in the form of blood or honey. And then, of course, what the historical sources aren't able to describe, because they didn't have the medical knowledge at the time, was the damage done by bacterial infection and internal decay, causing even more bloating, the liquefaction of organs into mush, and the early stages of sepsis, which again would attract even more insects and maggots in a vicious cycle of decomposition and rot. Blowflies laid eggs in his wounds, maggots chewed through his flesh, carrion beetles burrow beneath his skin, and his own gut bacteria, freed by infection, began to digest him from the inside. And it was that would finally kill the victim after day upon day upon day of the forced feeding, the hot sun, and an ever-increasing number of insects and other putrid events. The victim would slowly rot and be eaten, turning from a man into a liquid mess by the end. To quote Plutarch again, "When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon and, as it were, growing to his inwards. In this way Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired." Now, when I was first reading about this, my first thought was that why didn't the victim just try and rock the boat in order to try and flip the chamber over, causing a much faster death by drowning? After all, these boats would have had to have been relatively small if they allowed for your limbs and your head to stick out of the sides, so it must have been possible to flip them. And this is where I think we might be getting the boats wrong. See, in all of the pictures I've been able to find, the boats are left on the water, giving the impression that the entire time the victim was floating. But I don't think this is accurate. None of the historical sources mention that the boat was floating. It's not in Plutarch's description, and it's not in Xenarus's either. My guess is that the boats were probably placed in a small ditch or hole in the earth, so that no matter how hard the victim thrashed, their fate was inevitable. Plus, if the boats were to be on land, not the water, then it stands to reason that it wouldn't just be flies and maggots that could get to the victim, but also rats and ants' nests, which could work their way through whatever took their fancy. Now, before you go to bed with too many nightmares, there's actually some pretty convincing arguments to be made that Scaism, that is the death by boats we just covered and the death of Mithridates, may have actually never happened. See, Xenarus's description is thought to come from the Greek historian Ctesias, who has a reputation for exaggerating and sometimes just making things up about people he didn't like, and the Persians were one of those groups he might have wanted to paint as especially cruel and violent. Again, Plutarch, the main source that we have, is also writing this about 500 years after it all went down, and he also was not above the odd exaggeration when it suited him to paint a picture in the reader's mind. There's also no archaeological evidence of the boats, no carvings, no illustrations, no grave sites. There's also no records at all of its use. And the Persians left behind plenty of stories about mass crucifixions, impalements, beheadings and so on. They weren't at all shy about being nasty when they wanted to be, and a punishment as brutal as Scaism would probably be done to send a message, and so it seems unusual to me that they go through all this cruelty just to send a message and then not actually record that message. In fact, Scaism may be more Greek than Persian. See, the word Scaism actually comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning trough or boat. So, if the Greeks didn't get the idea from the Persians, who did they get it from? And the answer to that question is themselves. You see, there's a close cousin of Scaism, another brutal form of torture involving a controlled rotting of the victim called siphonism, which had been practiced in Greece for quite some time, and the process involves tying someone to a stake, slathering them with honey, and leaving them for the insects and pests to pick apart. Sometimes the victim would be allowed to go alive after a day or two. Sometimes they'd be put out of their misery after a sufficient period of time by being taken off this stake and thrown over a cliff. And then, of course, if they'd been really naughty, sometimes they'd be left to go and rot all of the way. And perhaps, just perhaps, Scaism was actually the brainchild of a Greek mind, taking this already horrifying punishment to its absolute worst extremes. Either way, it's all pretty grim stuff. It's the 10th of April 1905. We're in a market somewhere in Beijing, the capital of China, under the closing years of the Qing dynasty. A crowd has gathered to watch a scruffy young Mongolian man named Fa Chu Li as he's marched to his place of execution, where he will suffer one of the worst deaths imaginable as he is taken apart inch by agonizing inch in a process known as Lingchi, which translates literally to lingering death, or perhaps more popularly called death by 1,000 cuts. The man has been accused of murdering his own master, the prince of the Aohan Banner in the south of Chinese-held Inner Mongolia. The story goes that this Mongol guard had taken up arms against the prince after he tried to take advantage of his position and forced himself onto the guard's own wife. Fa Chu Li was acting either to protect his family or exact his revenge. Whatever the circumstances may be, though, the crime itself is utterly shocking. For the Qing administration, it's a clear-cut case of shi jun, the slaying of one's own lord, known more formally to us as regicide. Under the Confucian Code of Ethics, violence against a master, father, or emperor were all considered to be unthinkable acts that disturbed the natural harmony of the universe and invited chaos into the realm. This means that, no matter the details, the crime of regicide falls under something called the 10 Abominations, acts that were considered so evil and unnatural that they affected not just the victims, but nature herself. And in Chinese law, someone found guilty of one of these 10 abominations would be subjected to the worst punishments available and could not be pardoned or excused, even by the emperor himself. For Fa Chu Li, the consequences of murdering a superior were about to become very real. The Mongolian princes demanded that Chu Li be burned alive for his crime. But since the emperor at the time, Daizong of Qing, found this form of torture too barbaric, it was switched out instead for Lingchi. However, Lingchi was considered so cruel and inhumane that it was actually slated to be banned within 2 weeks of Chu Li's death. And so the board had to move quickly to make sure he received this sentence before they missed their chance to inflict the maximum suffering possible. And so Chu Li was sentenced to undergo Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts, on the 10th of April 1905. The process began by tying Chu Li to a wooden frame so that his arms are tied behind his back and his naked body is exposed to the crowd and the executioner. Then an extremely sharp scalpel is used to take off chunks of flesh, one slice at a time. First, they would start with the extremities, taking off sections of the thighs, calves, forearms, fingers and biceps, before slowly working their way inwards towards the body, stripping away the intercostal muscles to expose bare ribs, and beginning to amputate entire limbs as the victim slowly fades in and out of consciousness. To quote Sir Henry Norman, who recounts the process of Lingchi in his book The Politics and People of the Far East, the executioner, grasping handfuls from the fleshy parts of the body such as the thighs and breasts, slices them away. The limbs are cut off piecemeal at the wrists and ankles, the elbows and knees, shoulders and hips. Death would be put on hold for as long as possible, and when the executioner sensed that his victim was beginning to expire, the blade was plunged into the chest and through the heart. We don't know how long Chu Li lasted, but it's reasonable to assume that death did not come quickly for him. However, once he finally passed, the ordeal would still continue as he was removed from the stake and the scalpel was swapped out for a sword, which was used to further hack the body until he no longer resembled a person, but instead a pile of constituent parts smited away from one another. We know all of this because it's one of the few public executions involving torture that we have actual real photographs for. Obviously, I can't show you them here because they're way too graphic for YouTube, but they're not hard to find. Be warned though, they're extremely unpleasant and disturbing. Don't go looking for these if you're sensitive. Do yourself a favour and just take my word for it. It's debated who took these photographs in the first place, but it was most likely a French soldier stationed in Beijing during the ordeal. One thing that's not debated though is that these photographs shocked the international community, and to an extent, they forever immortalised Lingchi as a barbaric form of torture from the Far East. However, all human civilizations have had their ways of inflicting cruelty on others, and despite the controversy this caused on the international stage, let's not forget that China was already scheduled to do away with this punishment, as we mentioned earlier. So, on the 24th of April 1905, this abolition was made official, and Lingchi was banned as a form of execution. This meant that Fo Chu Li should have been the last ever case of someone being subjected to this end, and although he was the last official case, the horror would continue, with one unconfirmed case involving a soldier in 1907, and some shaky accounts that Lingchi had been performed as late as the 1920s and 30s during China's turbulent unrest. But even if Chu Li was the last, he certainly wasn't the first. Forms of Lingchi had been around in China since the earliest emperors, and some say it was used as early as the 9th century BC, but it wouldn't be codified as a legal punishment until the 7th century AD under the Tang dynasty, and although it was used from time to time then, it would still take a couple more centuries before it started to take centre stage in Chinese crime and punishment, which we'll get into shortly. Part of the reason that the use of Lingchi has its peaks and troughs throughout Chinese history was that it was always seen as an immensely controversial form of punishment. See, to Western observers, it just looks like a very cruel and nasty way to extend someone's suffering for as long as possible. But for Chinese culture, there was an added level of horror that's often lost on us. This is a bit of a simplification, but what Christianity is to Western thought, Confucianism is to Chinese thought, and under Confucian ethics, the integrity of your physical body is a really, really important part of your moral and spiritual existence. To quote Confucius directly, the body, hair and skin are received from one's parents. One must not injure or wound them. This is the beginning of filial piety. So, by subjecting someone to Lingchi, you're not just subjecting them to immense pain, but you're also turning them into something less than human. You're severing their connection to their ancestors and family by mutilating their body, and you're denying them access to the afterlife as a whole person, because now they're in little chunks. It's not unlike the process of being hanged, drawn and quartered in medieval Europe, where the goal is not just to exert power and inflict physical suffering, but also to punish them in the next life and reduce their memory and legacy to one of degradation, indignity and humiliation. For this reason, several attempts had been made throughout China to try and ban its use. One under the 9th century Emperor Shi Jingtang, although it was later reinstated, and then again in the 12th century when the poet Lu You wrote against Lingchi, and his argument was as follows. When the muscles of the flesh are already taken away, the breath of life is not yet cut off. The liver and heart are still connected. Seeing and hearing still exist. It affects the harmony of nature. It is injurious to a benevolent government and does not befit a generation of wise men. However, try as these individuals might, the practice stuck around, and by the 15th and 16th centuries it became a staple part of law and order within China. But the brutality of its use did vary, and scholars often disagree about just how savage the process actually was for the victim, since there was very little formalised detail on how it should be carried out. How bad it was really did just depend on the time, the place, and the crime. Some legal codes specify there should be 100 cuts before death arrives. Others say it must be 3,000, which seems a little high to me. And then, of course, we have lots of stories of the executioners taking bribes from the family of victims and, in exchange, giving them absolutely monstrous doses of opium or slitting them across the throat or heart first in order to spare the victim unnecessary suffering. A man named George Ernst Morrison was actually able to write down an eyewitness account of Lingchi in the 19th century book An Australian in China, in which he describes Lingchi in a way that is both better and worse than we might think. It's a bit long, but it's worth it. To quote, "The prisoner is tied to a rude cross, invariably deeply under the influence of opium. The executioner, standing before him with a sharp sword, makes 2 quick incisions above the eyebrows and draws down the portion of skin over each eye. Then he makes 2 more quick incisions across the breast, and in the next moment he pierces the heart, and death is instantaneous." So, the only thing the prisoner suffers, in Morrison's account, is having the skin from his own eyebrows pulled down over his face so he can't see. Anyway, Morrison continues. Then he cuts the body into pieces, and the degradation consists in the fragmentary shape in which the prisoner has to appear in heaven. So, whether or not the victim is alive for the most gruesome bit seems to be almost a secondary issue. It's the spiritual horror that really brings this all to life for the victims. But again, Lingchi changes depending on the circumstances, and there's no guarantee your mortal existence would end with any mercy shown. One particularly grim case was that of a eunuch named Liu Jun, who was accused of conspiring against the interests of the emperor in the 16th century. For his betrayal, he was sentenced to death by Lingchi, and his executioners pulled no punches. His death was reported to have lasted 3 days, and he endured a total of 3,300 separate cuts and incisions before finally succumbing on the stake, completely unrecognisable as his limbs, skin, flesh and face had been methodically sliced off from his body, one single piece at a time. It's said that the local people harboured such a hatred towards Liu Jun that when the execution was completed, they started bartering with the executioner, offering money in exchange for small strips of flesh, which they then ate with wine in order to further destroy his remains and express their anger at his betrayal of their emperor. All of this leads us to the story that inspired me to make this video in the first place, an event known as the Palace Plot of Renyin Ye. Now, every time I do a video on China, I have to take a second aside to say that Chinese history goes exceptionally hard, and this story is no exception, so bear with me, it's worth it. It forever vindicates the immortal line that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And yes, it ends in Lingchi. Lots and lots of Lingchi. So, the story begins in the year 1542 with 4 people taking centre stage. First, you've got the Emperor Yao Zhai and his primary wife, Empress Fang. Then, you've got 2 of the Emperor's concubines, Duan and Ning. Now, Emperor Yao Zhai can share a bed with any of these women, but he's particularly fond of Duan, and as a result, both his wife Fang and his other concubine Ning start to get pretty jealous. It gets weirder though, because Yao Zhai happens to also be an aspiring alchemist, and he believes that a concoction called red lead will help him live to an unnaturally long age. The problem is that the primary ingredient in this elixir is the menstrual blood of young women. So, in order to keep the supply of red lead, he collects a harem of young girls around 13 to 14 years old and has them restricted to a diet of just mulberry leaves and rainwater. Anything else, and the elixir won't do its job. This predictably makes the girls really quite unwell, and before long they get sick of the diet and fed up of being used as human cattle for this depraved resource. So we've got a bunch of young girls desperate to escape their torment and personally angry with their emperor. Now, around this time, Emperor Yaozhai and his concubine Ning start to have a bit of a fallout, and as a result, Ning starts going around the palace saying that Yaozhai has lost the mandate of heaven and become bewitched by his favourite consort Duan, who is in fact not a woman, but a fox spirit sent to enchant the emperor. This might sound like a bit of a lover's tiff, but telling people that Yaozhai had lost the mandate of heaven meant that he no longer had divine authority to rule. She was literally telling people he wasn't fit to be emperor and it was okay to dethrone him. Very naughty. But Yaozhai keeps it cool and basically puts Ning on the naughty step by forcing her to go and cool off by hanging around with the harem of girls he was using to collect blood for his red lead potion. However, Ning does the opposite of cool down and instead she capitalizes on the hatred that these young girls have for the emperor and talks them into a plot to murder him. So, one night when the emperor was hanging out with his favourite consort, Duan, a group of these girls break into the chamber and overpower the emperor and start strangling him with a line of hemp. But the rope breaks before the job is done and all they've managed to do is strangle him until he passes out. At this stage, one of the girls, named Zhang Jinliang, sees all this going down, realizes what's happening, and then runs to the emperor's wife, Empress Fang, and tells her that her husband is under attack by the girls and that he needs help. Empress Fang then rocks up to the chamber, has all the girls arrested, and then has her husband taken to safety. Now, even though the girls didn't manage to kill the emperor, he was left basically comatose, which meant that Empress Fang had the responsibility of finding out who was guilty and what their punishment should be. But instead of going through all the work of figuring out who the ringleaders actually were and why they did it, she just stuck the whole thing in the too hard bin and had them all executed, including Zhang Jinlian, the one who came to alert the Empress in the first place. But the plot thickens. See, the Empress didn't just kill all the girls who conspired against her husband, but she also saw an opportunity to get rid of her love rival, the Emperor's own favourite, Duan. And she did this on the basis that it happened in Duan's room, so Duan must have been guilty. All the girls involved were sentenced to death, and the method of execution was, predictably, Lingchi, and they had their remains hanged on meat hooks for all to see. 17 girls in total, nearly all under the age of adulthood, died in the most unspeakable way imaginable. But 3 days after all this, Emperor Yaozhai wakes up from his coma, goes outside and sees the meat hooks with all the victims arranged across them, and when he finds out his favourite lover had been murdered over all of this, he never forgives his wife for her bloodlust, and her plan to keep her husband to herself by having his lover murdered backfires massively. So massively, in fact, that 5 years later, in 1547, a massive fire breaks out in the imperial palace, and when Emperor Yaozhai escapes the flames, he tells his guards not to bother going back to save her, and to instead let her roast in the collapsing palace. She, predictably, was burned to death, and with that, all of the women in the story were now dead, leaving only the emperor standing, who would later claim that the death of his wife was all the will of heaven and had nothing to do with him or his actions. So, if you want to stay in one piece, never mix love with politics. On a hot morning in the year 30 AD, a man named John was taken from his cell and marched to the public square. He had suffered 2 days in a sweltering cell with minimal food and water and continual psychological abuse from his captors. As he walked through the morning light, onlookers had already gathered to watch his fate. He was about to endure the first stage of crucifixion. His hands trembled as they were fastened to a wooden stake in the centre of the square. With this came the final realization that this was actually happening. Countless other enemies of Rome had met this fate, but nothing could have possibly prepared John for the absolute horror he was about to endure. This is probably the worst way you can die, Rome had applied all the twisted genius it could muster into the most slow, painful, and humiliating death known to history. But how do we know all of this, and who's John? Well, in 1968, archaeologists in Jerusalem uncovered the remains of a man named Yehohanan ben Hakol, which has since just been shortened to John, the English equivalent of his original name. His remains provide rare physical evidence of crucifixion. Archaeologists found a nail through his heel, fractures in his legs, and a fully engraved tombstone. Today, we'll reconstruct John's ordeal, step by step, from his initial sentencing all the way to his last breath. Through a mixture of physical evidence and historical accounts, we'll uncover the terrifying logic behind crucifixion. We don't know exactly what John was accused of, but given the extreme nature of his punishment, we can reasonably assume he had been involved in some kind of act that undermined the Roman rule over Judea. In other words, John was a political rebel. After his sentencing, he was forced to wait for his torment. He was told that it was so he could make peace with his God and have time to reflect. The reality is that the Roman administration needed time to gather resources and make the arrangements for the public spectacle that crucifixion was. It's impossible to imagine what must have been going through his mind as he sat in a dingy cell, contemplating his last 2 days on earth and the horror before him. Nobody escaped a Roman sentence. All he could hope for was an official pardon, which never came. Before long, John was in the square, awaiting the first stages of the worst fate known to man. While being tied to the stake and stripped to the waist, a lictor, a soldier trained in torture and punishment, would prepare something called a flagrum. This was a kind of whip with a wooden handle and spikes, bone fragments, or sometimes even fish hooks attached to the end of the leather thongs. Once John was tied and his back was bare, the lictor struck him countless times. As the whip cracked across his back and shoulders, the spikes would embed themselves into his flesh, tearing away chunks of skin, muscle, and fat as the whip cracked over and over. It must have been the most excruciating pain John had ever felt in his life, as a thunderclap of leather and metal stripped away at the flesh between the whip and his spine, revealing the bones around his ribs and shoulders. This process, known as scourging, would leave John too weak to resist anything that came next, as his nervous system went into complete shock and the blood from his back ran down his legs and to his feet. Scourging was so shocking and so traumatic that people would often die where they stood, their bodies giving out under the strain of repeated strikes. John would not be so lucky. For him, the horror was only just beginning. And so, after what must have felt like a lifetime, John was untied from the stake and ordered to march. A patibulum, the horizontal part of the crucifix, was put on his shoulder and he was forced to drag himself and the wooden beam to his execution site. As he mustered the strength to put one foot in front of another, a crowd would gather along the sides of the streets. Some would look on horrified as the bloody mess inched towards his death, while others would cheer and mock the condemned as he passed them by. Now at this point you may be wondering, if the process is already this brutal and those who were sentenced to this fate already knew that, why didn't they resist? Surely trying to fight and dying while resisting would be faster and less painful than crucifixion. And again, we return to that brutal logic that the Romans used throughout the entirety of the process. Firstly, after scourging, you would be suffering from blood loss, shock, dizziness, and confusion. It would be almost impossible for you to make an active decision about your options because you would be completely overwhelmed by the ordeal of scourging. Secondly, if you did resist, then your family and friends would be used as collateral and suffer the same fate as you. So your only option was to endure the suffering to protect those you love. Thirdly, even if you still felt like fighting back to avoid or hasten your death, then the lictors, those soldiers who were trained for this business, were under strict instruction not to kill you if you resisted, and instead they would restrain you and then find ways to make the whole ordeal even worse for you, and we'll get to that in a bit. So onwards John would march, as his place of final resting would inch closer and closer into view. As he walked, a titulus would dangle under his neck, a small sign which marked his name and the crime he was accused of. We don't know exactly how long he was forced to march for. It would always change depending on the layout of the town and the thickness of the crowd, but typically this grueling march would last between 15 minutes and a full hour. It's an unthinkable distance when you consider the abuse from the crowd, the patibulum across his back which weighed around 60 kilograms, and the shocking blood loss that came as a result from his scourging. Once John finally finished the longest walk of his life, he would be given a short moment to gather himself as he received any last religious rites, a chance to make a final statement, and, if he was lucky, the chance to say goodbye to family and friends, although this was very rare. After this, he was stripped completely bare, another humiliation added to the process. Once naked, he was forced to lay on his tattered back with arms outstretched across the patibulum that he had dragged with him. Under the patibulum would be the stipes, the vertical part of the crucifix, and now that the two were together, it would take on its signature cross shape. Now the cross was assembled, his hands would be fixed to the wood itself. We often see images of crucifixion showing nails going through the hands, but this wouldn't have worked since the small bones in the hand wouldn't be able to support the weight of a body, allowing the crucified to fall to the ground. The hands were not attached by tying them either. Instead, the arms were attached to the wood via a 7-inch long nail, which would be hammered through the wrist of the victim. And so, as John laid back, he would have felt the metal tip of a nail gently prodding against his wrist and forearm in order to find the exact spot between the radius and the ulna. Once the lictor was confident he had found the right place, this gentle prodding would have turned to a crushing penetration as the nail was hammered through his wrist, one bone-crunching strike at a time. The Roman lictors would have taken care to avoid any major blood vessels to make sure this death was slow, but it was perfectly normal for nerves to be trapped between the nail and bone, making an already horrifying ordeal that much more excruciating. After the arms were fixed in place, the feet would be next. It differs from one instance to another, but from the evidence, we can see that John received his nails here, on the side of his feet by the heel. This was in order to inflict the most pain possible, as he would need to bear his weight with his feet in order to breathe, but we'll get more onto that shortly. After being securely nailed to the crucifix, a small platform would be placed just under his feet called a sedile, which would give John something to lean on as he dangled from his nailed wrists and heels. The entire display was then lifted into the air into a vertical position and gently placed into a hole so that the entire crucifix would remain upright. The process wasn't gentle out of kindness, but instead because any violent jarring of the crucifix may cause the victim's limbs to tear, rendering one or more parts of them free from the nails. Now that John was upright, the true torture could begin. Suspended upright and dangling from the nails that had been smashed through his limbs, John would immediately struggle to breathe. The position of his body would place pressure on his chest and lungs, making inhalation impossible. In order to take a breath, John would have to straighten his legs and pull on his wrists, which must have been unbelievably painful. As he pushed himself upwards, he would scrape the exposed muscle and bone on his back alongside the rough surface of the crucifix, peppering his flesh with splinters. Once finally extended, he would take a breath before collapsing back down and continuing to asphyxiate. This would continue for hours, sometimes days, as he alternated between excruciating breaths and passive breathlessness. Death could occur in any number of ways and depended almost completely on the individual strength of those being executed. Blood loss, asphyxiation, and cardiac arrest were the most common killers. Onlookers would often taunt those hung up upon the crosses, and they were typically left in public spaces as a warning to anyone else who might consider breaking the laws of Rome. We can be relatively certain that John did not die quickly during his ordeal, because there is archaeological evidence of something called crucifixion. It was the only act of kindness he received since being sentenced. If someone is taking too long to die, or the Romans wish to end their suffering prematurely, they would smash the legs of the victims with a large mallet in order to break the bones in their legs. This would make it impossible for them to drag themselves upright and breathe, which hastened the process of asphyxiation. Death would occur shortly after this final act of brutal mercy. Since the legs in John's skeleton were broken, we can reasonably assume he had lasted long enough on the cross for the Romans to take pity on him and put him out of his misery. We have no idea if that was hours or days. We mentioned earlier that there were ways they could make the whole ordeal worse for people who tried to resist, and this was one of them, by ensuring that the execution never ends in a mercy killing. After one of the worst deaths imaginable, the body would be brought down and buried. But how long after death that would happen would depend on the message that Rome was trying to send. It wasn't uncommon for corpses to rot on their crucifixes for months before being taken down. After the Spartacist uprisings in 71 BC, over 6,000 captured slaves who had revolted against Rome were crucified, and their corpses lined the 120-mile stretch of road named the Appian Way, which connected Rome to Capua. At one point, the Romans even ran out of wood and materials to crucify that many people. This was human suffering on an unimaginable scale. It was a signal to any slave who considered disobedience. Here be your fate. And that's really all that crucifixion was about. It was one of the most horrific punishments ever witnessed. And that was exactly the point. To install a petrifying fear into anybody who dared to even consider challenging the will of Rome. It's the 25th of March 1119. A young French knight named Pierre Basile is standing duty in the castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the southwest of France. He's one of just 2 knights currently stationed at the castle. They're not expecting much trouble deep in these provincial heartlands. But then, as Pierre Basile looks over the ramparts, he sees the worst sight possible. Marching over the horizon is an army headed by the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, a veteran of the Third Crusade, undefeated in open battle and renowned for his ferocity. Upon seeing the English approach, the Frenchmen inside the fortress scramble to try and put up some defence against these insurmountable odds. But the castle itself is so ill prepared for a fight that Basile has to resort to cobbling together armour out of whatever he could find, including using a makeshift shield constructed from a frying pan. Although an act of incredible determination and bravery, choosing to resist such overwhelming odds will have consequences for young Basile. Within just 2 weeks, he'll die one of the worst deaths imaginable, as his skin is torn from his living flesh in a process known as flaying. But it doesn't go down how you might think. When the English spot this undermanned, under-equipped fortress, they conclude that this probably won't be the most challenging fight. So much so that King Richard himself feels confident to stroll around the castle grounds without even wearing his armour. Young Basile sees the King of England roaming unprotected, and it's just too good of a target. He lifts his crossbow over the ramparts, lines up his sight, and lets loose the bow. He sees the bolt fly through the air and sink directly into the king's chest. Bullseye. The mortally wounded king was pulled back to his tent, and with this, Basile expected that the invaders would just pack up and leave. But to his surprise, the siege continued just as before, and within less than a week, he would be captured by the English besiegers. Once in custody, he's dragged before Richard the Lionheart, who it turns out is not dead from the crossbow bolt, but is nonetheless dying from gangrene, which has begun to fester within the wound itself. Richard asks young Basile why he had struck him with the crossbow, and instead of trying to claim it was an accident or an unfortunate byproduct of war, Basile looks this dying king in the eye and tells him flatly that it was vengeance for his brothers dying at the hands of the English. Although not known for his sensitivity, Richard is moved by the young knight's bravery and honesty, and as his final act on earth, he grants the boy mercy. He tells the young Basile, "Live on, and by my bounty behold the light of day." With this, the dying king gives the knight 100 shillings and sends him away in peace. And shortly after, he dies in his mother's arms on the 6th of April, 1199. However, upon Richard's death, the king's right-hand man, a mercenary named Mercadier, takes control of the situation, and he's in no mood for mercy. Whatever the king's last wishes may have been, there was no way in hell that Mercadier was going to let this king-killing crossbowman go in peace. He had Pierre Basile arrested, and as punishment for the regicide, he ordered that Pierre be put to death by the process of flaying. We have very few details about the specific case of Pierre Basile, but flaying was used regularly within medieval Europe, and as a result, we know quite a bit about how it would be typically performed. Be warned though, the process is pretty grim. Usually, you would start by curing or blanching the skin, which in hotter regions would mean tying someone outside to suffer extreme sunburn, or more likely in the case of Basile, boiling water would be poured over the body inch by inch in order to inflame the skin, making the process of peeling it away that much easier for the executioner. It should go without saying that this alone would be excruciatingly painful, as the victim suffers third-degree burns over the entirety of their body. Boiling water is repeatedly poured onto the skin over and over, causing the flesh to soften and the dermis, the thick inner layer of your skin, to loosen. In the case of flaying, however, this unimaginable pain is just the prelude to the real horror. The process can vary a little bit between time and place, but generally, the executioner would want to keep as much of your skin intact as possible, preferably tearing away the entire layer in one piece. To this end, you would be tied with your limbs outstretched, sometimes upside down, and then the executioner would slice a ring around your ankles and wrists before working inwards towards the centre of your body. The executioners would then begin to peel your skin away section by section, but sometimes they would kind of peel as they went until they felt confident that your skin was loose enough, at which point one man would grab the loose tag on each arm and they would both pull the entirety of your skin away in one violent but precise tug. In either case, it would be unthinkable pain, honestly unlike anything words could describe. We cover a lot of historical torture and execution methods on this channel, and most of them have a component of internal trauma, like impalement or being hanged, drawn and quartered. And although they're grim, if we're just going to measure pain alone, being flayed alive is in a totally different league. Thousands upon thousands of nerve receptors inside the dermis would be screaming after the skin was blanched with boiling water, and now those same receptors are firing away as the skin is being ripped away from the flesh, and then finally these receptors, now raw and hypersensitive, are left completely exposed without the protective skin, meaning that even a simple breeze would cause a wave of white-hot pain to completely overwhelm the victim. The limbic system, the part of your brain responsible for regulating emotion, would become utterly overwhelmed by this complete and total trauma, meaning that even the most steadfast and courageous victims would be reduced to a whimpering mess, screaming in agony and begging their tormentors for mercy through a cacophony of crying and tears. Fading in and out of consciousness was almost always a guarantee, but victims could quickly be brought back around with cold water either to the face or that newly exposed flesh. The process could last anywhere from 30 minutes to 5 or 6 hours, depending on the proficiency of the knifeman and the severity of the sentence. And here's where it gets even worse. Flaying someone alive doesn't kill them, at least not for a while. No major blood vessels or internal organs are damaged during the process, so there's nothing to actually put a victim out of their misery. If left to their own devices, the victim could last hours or days until they would finally perish from either infection or hypothermia, as their body is left without its protective layer with which to cope with the outside world. If you are really lucky, you might die from shock during the process as the body tries to compute this unbelievable level of trauma. But that's if you're lucky. Most people would need to be killed or left to die after the procedure had been completed. And by the way, the sheer state that the victims would work themselves into was often enough to have an effect on the people watching, and there are cases of this brutal method of execution actually causing harm to the spectators, including one case, which we'll get into later. In the case of Pierre Basile, we know he managed to survive the entire procedure because once the entirety of the skin had been removed from his body, this screaming, walking corpse was dragged to a makeshift gallows where he was finally hanged. And all this to a man that, let's not forget, had been publicly pardoned by a king. Justice was rough in the medieval period, and as for Macadier, the man who ordered this punishment, he would also get a taste when a year later, some other mercenaries ambushed him and put him to the sword in Bordeaux. But despite how utterly savage this whole tale was, it's not really that unusual for medieval Europe. In 1303, Richard of Pudlicot, an English wool merchant, robbed part of King Edward I's treasury at Westminster Abbey. He, along with his high-ranked accomplices, primarily consisting of monks from the abbey, stole enough of the king's gems, antique gold and coins to equate to about a year's tax revenue for the entire Kingdom of England. Once captured, Richard tried to save his accomplices by giving a false confession that he was the only one involved in the crime. Nevertheless, over a dozen others were also found guilty, and they were hanged, and then flayed. All for the crime of stealing from the crown. Legend has it that Richard's flayed skin was nailed to the door of Westminster Abbey as a warning to other aspiring criminals. Now, before you start thinking that this is just a medieval thing, you should know that flaying is probably one of the oldest methods of torture that we have records for, which isn't surprising, given that the point of all of these cruelties is to install terrifying fear into the population, and flaying is nothing else if not absolutely terrifying. As early as the 9th century BC, ancient kings, such as Ashurnasirpal II, were flaying people, and the act was as much about propaganda as it was about punishment or revenge. To quote Ashurnasirpal directly, "I have made a pillar facing the city gate, and have flayed all the rebel leaders. I have clad the pillar in their flayed skins. I let the leaders of the conquered cities be flayed, and clad the city walls with their skins." And it wasn't just a verbal warning, they even went to the effort of inscribing the events onto stone pillars, which is what you're looking at right now. So it really is a punishment as old as time, and as execution methods go, it's also stood the test of time quite well. In the late 18th century, a shipbuilder from Crete named Daskaloggianis tried to lead a revolt against the Ottoman Empire, but when the rebellion failed, he was forced to surrender. The Ottomans had actually promised clemency to all the rebels that surrendered and agreed to pay up their taxes, but once they got their hands on Daskaloggianis, they switched tacts and decided instead to make an example of him. And so, on the 17th of June 1771, he was flayed alive before a crowd, before ultimately being beaten to death. It was reported that he suffered the entire ordeal in complete silence, but his brother was forced to watch the entire affair, which caused him to suffer a mental break, and he fell into a state of insanity from which he was never able to properly recover. It doesn't just stop there though, we have cases as late as the Second World War, one in 1941 involving a Serbian priest named Daman Šterbac, who was skinned alive by Croatian fascists in Jadovno concentration camp before being tossed into a pit to expire. Although his detainers attempted to replace his name with the prisoner identification number 577, his real name would eventually become immortalized when he was canonized as a saint by the Serbian Orthodox Church. The other case during World War II was said to have happened in Lyon, where a French resistance fighter was reportedly flayed by the Butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie, sometime between 1942 and 1944. But we would still be at this even after the horrors of the Second World War, even as late as today, where it remains an infamous use of execution amongst organised crime gangs in Central and South America. All of this kind of begs the question. Unlike classical punishments, like crucifixion, the breaking wheel, or being hanged, drawn and quartered, why do we see flaying nearly everywhere? It turns up in the 9th century BC and follows us until today in the 21st century. It's there in medieval Europe, and it's there in Ming China. I mean, it's a really complicated and drawn out process, but at the same time, it's so prevalent across so many times and places. What's the deal? In Ernst G. Jung's book, A Short Cultural History of Skin, he argues that flaying can be seen across so many cultures and eras for 3 reasons. 1, it's an absolutely terrifying spectacle, which makes it perfect for installing terror into any who were forced to witness the affair. 2, the skin is the part of our body that everyone sees and recognises us by. Let's not forget that our faces are, of course, covered in skin. By removing this part of a person, one doesn't just sentence them to excruciating pain, but one also takes away a key part of their identity, making them no longer a person, but instead a living, breathing spectacle of suffering. When you look at someone who's been flayed, you don't see the face of a person anymore. That's been stripped away. What's left is the face of horror itself. Third and lastly, there's a quasi-religious, symbolic thing going on here that lots of cultures have picked up on. From Christian imagery of martyrs who've been flayed holding their own skin in heaven, such as St. Bartholomew in Michelangelo's The Last Testament, all the way to the Mesoamerican god Xipe-Totec, the god of birth, death and rebirth, who flayed himself to give food to humanity and is usually depicted red to represent the fact that he's missing his own skin. I think it's interesting that in both cases, the symbolism of rebirth is front and centre, with St. Bartholomew being reborn in heaven, and Xipe-Totec, or our Lord the Flayed One, is quite literally the deity of rebirth. Regardless of the religious symbolism though, there are many ways that one can shed their skin and become reborn into something more authentically and truly themselves. And I think we can all agree that being flayed alive is by far and away the worst way that you can shed this layer. On the morning of the 6th of November 1605, Sir William Wade, Lieutenant of the Tower of London, descended into the lower chambers of the complex. Between each step, he hears the howls and screams of those being tortured for their crimes. Fingers crushed under vices, nails drawn with forceps, hot steel pressed against exposed skin, limbs torn from sockets. It was, for a man of his macabre profession, another day at the office, but the events here will go down in history forever. As he enters one of the chambers of the White Tower, his victim comes into view. A tall man with a strong figure, unusually handsome, sporting a well-groomed moustache and a thick reddish beard. He'd been arrested in the early hours of the previous day. To his torturers, he's known only as John Johnson. But his real name is Guy Fawkes, the most famous conspirator in the Gunpowder Plot. Despite being imprisoned in the Tower of London for over 24 hours, Guy Fawkes, or John Johnson to his captors, hasn't said a word about his motivations, intentions, or co-conspirators. Even the King, James I, is impressed by Johnson's steadfast resistance, describing him as a man of Roman resolution. But Sir William Wade has something in his hand which is about to change everything. A letter, written and signed by the King himself, giving him express permission to start torturing Johnson for answers. First, by gentler methods, and finally, by the most brutal means available. Both men now know there's only one way this will end. The rack. It's an unthinkably cruel device which works by strapping the victim onto a table with their legs and arms stretched out and then attached to chains. These chains can then be retracted by a handle and ratchet mechanism so that the torturer can slowly but surely stretch the limbs beyond their limits and often to their breaking point. People have died on the rack, but it's not a tool of execution. It's a torture device designed to subject the victim to excruciating pain which increases at slow, predictable increments. At first, it just hurts as muscles and tendons begin to strain under pressure. Then the pain is unbearable as these muscles and tendons start to tear away from one another. Then panic strikes as the victim comes to realise that if the rack is tightened any further, the damage will be permanent as joints are dislocated with a sickening pop and crack that the torturers were all too familiar with. When taken even further, the limbs can be completely torn from their sockets, effectively dismembering the victim by tearing their arms and legs off inch by brutal inch. Before long on the rack, everyone spills their deepest secrets, but those who confess too late will never fully recover. Permanent paralysis, deformities, internal bleeding, and psychological trauma are the consequences that most victims carry for life. Niccolò Machiavelli was subjected to a form of the rack on 6 separate occasions, barely surviving and left with permanent damage to his chest and shoulders. Some argue that this exposure to brutal trauma would go on to inspire one of the darkest books of Western literature, The Prince, which is a guidebook for rulers recommending torture, public execution, and betrayal. It was a favourite of Joseph Stalin and Benito Mussolini, but it was so obscene that when it was first published in 1532, it was banned by the Pope for its unholy message, which can be summed up in one quote from Machiavelli, that leaders must learn to be not good. But let's get back to the rack. See, although it's a torture device designed to extract information, for those who don't talk, it can be quickly turned to a murder weapon. Pull the rack far enough and the victim will be left paralysed and immobile, at which point they can be simply discarded and left to die. Go further and the massive internal bleeding and shock can finish off victims before they even get a chance to be removed from the rack. If more lethal force was required still, during the later stages of the process, the torso can be smashed with blunt objects or crushed with heavy weights, leading to organ failure and more internal bleeding as shattered ribs press themselves into the delicate lungs and heart within the chest cavity. For our prisoner, Guy Fawkes, or John Johnson, the rack was all too familiar. One of the allies to his cause had been subjected to that same fate while he was just a teenager, and with harrowing effect. About midway through the process, a fire was lit underneath the frame in order to roast the teenage victim's back. It was common to mix the rack with other forms of torture in order to extract confessions and draw out the process for longer, since it allowed you to continue applying more pain without drawing the rack too quickly and killing or paralysing the victim. So a fire was lit under the boy's back, but because he'd been so badly cut and scourged in the earlier stages of the torture, the blood flowing from his back was enough to outright extinguish the fire beneath him. It's one of the nearly countless horrifying accounts of the rack, which was particularly popular in England during the late 16th and early 17th century. But it's not unique to England, nor this period. It had in fact been around quite a while. In 356 BC, it was applied to gain a confession from the Greek Herostratus, who was later executed for burning down the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Alexander the Great supposedly had his mentor and court historian Callisthenes tortured on the rack in 328 BC for trying to assassinate Alexander himself. The Roman Emperor Nero put a woman named Epicharis on the rack during the Picenonian conspiracy in 65 AD. According to the historian Tacitus, she lasted 2 days on the rack without giving away so much as a word of a confession. By the end, Her limbs were so broken that she had to be carried around on a sedan chair. It was on the way to being tortured again that she managed to strangle herself while being carried on the chair, escaping another round on that rack. The rack was a bad way to go, and both Guy Fawkes and William Wade knew it. But what was this Fawkes actually suspected of, and what kind of information did the king and his staff at the Tower of London expect to extract from this prisoner who was currently under the alias of John Johnson? Well, as it turns out, this Johnson was found under the Houses of Parliament in the early hours of Tuesday the 5th of November 1605. That alone would probably be enough for the authorities to subject you to some harsh questioning, but it turns out it wasn't just an unidentified man they found present in this restricted area, but also 25 barrels of gunpowder, enough to blow Parliament and everyone inside it to smithereens. What's more, Johnson was arrested just after midnight on the 5th of November, but later that same day, the king himself, as well as most of his retinue, was scheduled to visit the Houses of Parliament in order to officially open them. It didn't take a genius to figure out that whoever this man was, his intentions were to assassinate the king and decapitate his government in one move. It was during his arrest and subsequent detainment that the man we know as Guy Fawkes decided to give himself the alias of John Johnson, possibly to protect the identities of his fellow conspirators. But although he may have been shy on the details, he was very much open about his intent. When asked why he had been in possession of so much gunpowder during his arrest, he replied plainly, "To blow you Scottish beggars back to your native mountains." You see, although King James I wore the crown of England, he was in fact Scottish. But Guy Fawkes' desire to kill the king wasn't out of some kind of nationalist or patriotic agenda. His motivations were religious. For reasons that are far too complicated to cover in this video, England officially became Protestant in the 16th century, splitting from the Catholic Church of mainland Europe and kicking off a long period of civil unrest and religious beef. Guy Fawkes was originally raised Protestant, but during his later childhood he converted to Catholicism and became radicalised by the religious violence during these turbulent years. When the previous monarch, Elizabeth I, took the throne, she enacted a series of ultra-repressive laws to criminalise all Catholic influence within England, even going so far as to issue the death penalty to any priest who had received their training on the Catholic mainland. While all this religious persecution was going down in England, though, Fawkes set off for Spain, where he actively fought with the Catholic Spaniards against the Protestant Dutch, eventually getting recommended for captaincy in 1603. That same year, however, Queen Elizabeth died, James I took the throne, and Catholics across England breathed a sigh of relief. James wasn't Catholic, but his mother was, and he appeared to be much more tolerant and moderate than his predecessor Elizabeth. Fawkes and many of his Catholic allies who'd been driven underground could now live without the fear of being raided by priest hunters or denounced as Catholics by jealous neighbours. But then James started to crack down on Catholics just like Elizabeth had, and their cool relief turned to boiling rage. In 1604, a conspiracy was hatched to assassinate the king and replace him with his daughter, Princess Elizabeth Stuart, who they would see was raised Catholic. The ringleader of this conspiracy was not Guy Fawkes, but instead a man named Robert Catesby. However, although Catesby had the political vision, it was Guy Fawkes who understood war and violence after his experiences in Spain. By the time the men came up with the idea of blowing up Parliament, there was only one man in the conspiracy who had the technical knowledge to work with the gunpowder for maximum effect. And even if they pulled it off, it was probably a suicide mission. Fawkes was more than willing to volunteer, though. By November the 5th, 1605, the trap had been set, and Fawkes sat alone under the buildings of Parliament, waiting to strike with nearly a metric ton of explosives, ready to tear whatever and whoever above into shreds. Unfortunately for the conspirators, however, the plan had actually been rumbled weeks before the day of execution. On the 26th of October, Lord Monteagle received an anonymous letter advising him to avoid visiting Parliament on that day, which went on to read that they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. When Monteagle showed this letter to King James, an order was given to search the entire building the night before the big day. And it was during this search that they found Guy Fawkes standing alone by his gunpowder. A scuffle quickly ensued as Fawkes desperately tried to light the gunpowder before he could be captured, but he was quickly overwhelmed and taken into custody, upon which time he gave his name as John Johnson and told his captors flatly that he was planning to blow the king back to Scotland. This was not enough information, though. The king wanted to fully understand Guy Fawkes' ambitions, his co-conspirators, and the likelihood of any further threat. And so we find ourselves right back at the beginning, on the 6th of November 1605, with Guy Fawkes sitting in his cell in the White Tower and Sir William Wade standing over him, letter in hand. A licence to torture, a warrant for the subject of this video, the rack. We don't have exact details on how the rack was used on Guy Fawkes, but we know enough to know it was bad. His torture began in earnest on the 6th, and for that whole day, he said absolutely nothing. According to Wade, Fawkes even managed to rest throughout that night, despite the fact that he had warned his prisoner that he would be interrogated until I had gotten the inwards secret of his thoughts and all his accomplices. We can only imagine what horrors he must have endured through the entirety of that first day in the Tower of London. What we know for sure, though, is that by the next day, on the 7th, both his composure and his limbs began to crack. After a long stint on the rack, limbs being slowly torn from their sockets, he revealed the first morsel of information. He admitted that he was not, in fact, John Johnson, but instead his name was Guy Fawkes, and that there were 5 other co-conspirators in the plot. He might have imagined that this would be enough to save his body and his limbs from utter destruction. He was wrong. These crumbs of information did not satisfy his torturer's curiosity, and instead piqued it. They could see the man was finally breaking, physically and mentally. They could smell the blood in the water. But Fawkes wouldn't say another word until he had spent yet another 24 hours on the rack, being torn to pieces. On the 8th of November, he finally spilled the beans, naming some, but not all of the conspirators, and their intention to replace James I with his daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Another day then passed, another stint on the rack, another set of muscles ripped to shreds, ligaments torn, joints dislocated with a sickening pop, and finally, on the 9th, he named the last name, Francis Tresham. They had extracted the confession, but in the process, they had broken the man, quite literally. Look at this, it's a side-by-side of Fawkes' signature, both before and after his torture on the rack. In the early one, we can see it fairly clearly, but in the second one, he's barely able to put ink to paper after his hands, wrists and arms have been utterly shattered on the rack. With his full confession, he was taken to trial nearly 3 months later on the 27th of January 1606, where he pleaded not guilty. It was to no avail, though. The signed confession, his co-conspirators' behaviour and the obvious evidence made the case very simple. The jury found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to the worst punishment in the land, yes, even worse than the rack, the ordeal of being hung, drawn, and quartered. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, said that he was to be drawn to his execution by a horse, his genitals and bowels would be cut off and burnt before his eyes, his heart would be cut out, and then he would be beheaded and hacked into pieces before being displayed across the land as an example of anyone who attempts to murder the King of England. On the 31st of January, it began. He was taken along with his co-conspirators to the old palace yard at Westminster, directly opposite the same Parliament he had hoped to destroy. He was so injured from his time on the rack that even though nearly 3 months had passed, he still couldn't walk the stairs to the scaffold. But Guy Fawkes would get the last laugh. As they put the noose over his neck, he immediately jumped off of the scaffold, breaking his neck and killing him instantly, so that he could avoid the final moments of agonizing torture. And I think we can all agree that after 3 straight days on the rack, he'd had his fair share by then anyway. On the 29th of April 2014, a prisoner named Clayton Lockett is scheduled to undergo the death penalty by lethal injection in Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Many would call it justice. The man condemned to die is responsible for some pretty nasty stuff, and in 1999, he took the life of 19-year-old Stephanie Naiman, who endured unspeakable suffering under Lockett before being shot twice in the chest with a shotgun and then buried alive to expire from her wounds. Deserved as it may be, though, Mr. Lockett isn't too pleased about the whole ordeal, and he spends the day refusing to cooperate with his executioners. Things get so out of hand that at one point the prison staff have to taser him into submission. Later that day, he'll even try to cut himself open in order to bleed out before his execution and avoid enduring the lethal injection. It will, however, all be for naught. By 6 p.m, he had been successfully strapped into a gurney, which effectively restrained him so that the procedure could begin. But unfortunately for everyone involved, this is not an orderly conclusion to an otherwise eventful day. Actually, it's just the beginning of an absolute horror story, as the procedure goes wrong in nearly every way imaginable. Lethal injection typically works by injecting 3 separate drugs intravenously into the victim while they're restrained in a gurney. The first drug, usually sodium thiopental or pentobarbital, induces a state of unconsciousness in the victim within about 30 seconds, and in the doses required for the lethal injection, it's so potent that it will eventually cause death by depressing respiratory activity. But in order to ensure death every single time, 2 more drugs are administered. The second is pancuronium or vecuronium bromide, which further suppresses breathing activity by paralysing the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles. And then finally, the third drug, potassium chloride, is administered, which is the heart stopper. It causes an abnormal heartbeat and ultimately death by cardiac arrest. The first drug essentially knocks you out so you don't suffer, and the next 2 ensure that you die while you're unconscious. Well, that's how it works on paper. It's designed to be the most humane way to apply the death penalty, but in reality, it doesn't always go to plan, as in the case of Clayton Lockett. The first difficulty that staff faced during the procedure was that they were unable to insert an IV needle into any of Lockett's veins, trying first at the forearms, then at the biceps. When the paramedic was unable to successfully implant the IV, she asked for the help of a doctor named Johnny Zelmer to assist her. The mere fact that a qualified doctor who had sworn the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm was involved in the application of the death penalty remains an incredibly controversial detail. But with the help of the doctor, there were 3 more failed attempts to attach the IV. First, to the jugular vein in Lockett's neck. The next 2 attempts came to the left foot, then another failure at the subclavian vein next to the collarbone, and then finally, after 8 separate failed attempts, they were finally able to insert the IV into the femoral vein in Lockett's groin. Lockett's execution was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. It was now 6:20 p.m, and they had only just managed to insert an IV. Although it's difficult to feel sorry for Clayton given his previous crimes, I think we can all agree that that's a long time to wait for the inevitable, and it's about to get worse. At this stage, the curtain is drawn so that the witnesses can see Clayton alone in the room, strapped to the gurney and with the IV in his groin. While all of this was happening, a spokesman for the Oklahoma Corrections Department named Jerry Massey explained to the witnesses that they were using a different combination of drugs for this execution, and that they were switching out the first drug, the sedative pentobarbital, for something else called midazolam. "Don't be surprised," he said, "if the new sedative takes a little longer to take effect." This decision will have consequences. Lockett was then asked if he had any final words, to which he responded, no. Then, at 6:23 p.m, the execution began with the injection of the new sedative, midazolam. By 6:30 p.m, 7 minutes after the drug was administered, Lockett's eyes were closed, with his mouth slightly open, but his executioners had already felt something wasn't quite right. The prison warden, Anita Trammell, stood over the man in the gurney before declaring, "Mr. Lockett is not unconscious." Another setback, and so the procedure was put on hold for 3 minutes to wait and see how the midazolam would affect Lockett. By 6:33 p.m, with his head resting towards the witnesses, he was declared unconscious, and the following 2 drugs were injected: vecuronium bromide to suppress breathing and potassium chloride to stop the heart. At 6:36 p.m, around 3 minutes after these were injected, Lockett began to shake violently on the gurney before raising his head and trying to speak in a quiet but terrified voice. His exact words are contested by the eyewitnesses, but they were either, "Oh man, I'm not," or "Something's wrong." At this site, the warden ordered that the blinds be closed, and this was the last thing that the witnesses were able to observe. The torment itself, however, would go on for much longer. At 6:37 p.m, Lockett struggled to raise himself from the gurney before collapsing back down with a loud exhale. A lawyer present at the execution would go on to remark that it looked like torture, and to an extent, it was. If you remember, Oklahoma State Penitentiary had switched out the first drug for sedation, and so midazolam was used instead of the usual pentobarbital. Midazolam is not an anesthetic, it's a sedative, and so although Lockett was drowsy and paralysed, he was not unconscious or anaesthetised. He was lucid for the entire procedure and would have been able to experience the usual level of pain that one would when unmedicated. Once the next drug entered his body, he would have slowly felt himself become paralysed as the vecuronium bromide inched up his blood vessels and spread from his groin to his chest, where it would take effect on the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, and anything else that you need to respire. He was, in real time and whilst fully conscious, feeling himself asphyxiating as his lungs gradually refused to draw in each desperately needed breath. It would have felt like being buried alive from the inside. And then the next drug came, potassium chloride, which is the heart stopper. Potassium chloride works by upsetting the delicate balance of potassium and sodium inside your heart, and when these fall out of whack, you're unable to maintain a regular heartbeat. So when that balance is disrupted by an enormous dose of potassium chloride, cardiac arrest is inevitable. This means that, again, while still alive and conscious, Lockett would have essentially experienced the agony of a heart attack, all whilst being unable to talk, groan, or even gasp for air, because let's remember, his lungs are paralysed. It gets worse though, because potassium chloride is extremely painful once in the body, as the high concentrations of potassium ions activate nerve receptors inside the veins of the patient, which scream pain signals to the brain. Some doctors have even described the sensation of potassium chloride in the bloodstream as being like liquid fire coursing through your veins. Inch by inch, section by section of agonizing burning until it finally reaches your heart and finishes the job. All of this, of course, sounds utterly terrifying, and it does still actually somehow manage to get worse for Lockett. But first, many of you may be wondering why they switched out the procedure and used midazolam instead of the usual pentobarbital. And here's where things get kind of interesting. See, when a lot of these pharmaceutical companies, especially those in the EU, found out that their drugs were being used for executions, they didn't like it. Most of them halted the supply of these products to the US until they were assured that they wouldn't be used for the application of the death penalty. Since the US healthcare system relies on lots of these drugs for routine procedures and the business of saving lives, assurances were made and the US justice system lost its supply of pentobarbital. In response, individual states started to secretly stockpile their own sources of sedatives and anesthetics to be used in the lethal injection. Things got so bad that at one point the Drug Enforcement Agency was raiding state pharmaceutical inventories to make sure they weren't breaking the rules on using drugs for the death penalty, such as in 2011 where the DEA confiscated the state of Georgia's supply of UK-manufactured sodium thiopental, a sedative, because it hadn't yet been approved by the FDA and it was scheduled for use on death row inmates. Midazolam entered the scene as a suitable and available alternative to these foreign anesthetics, but as you and I now understand, this was not an appropriate substitute, so much so that within 3 weeks of Lockett's execution, some states even banned the use of midazolam in the euthanizing of animals because it was considered so inhumane and painful. Now, it's important to remember that the death penalty is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is the ending of a patient's life in order to reduce suffering, and is only euthanasia when it's used in the patient's best interests. The death penalty, on the other hand, is a punitive act, which is not used because it's in the prisoner's interest, but because it's in the state's interest. As such, you can quite easily make the argument that it doesn't need to be humane to the same degree that euthanizing animals is, but it's worth bearing in mind that the whole point of the death penalty by lethal injection is that it's supposed to be humane and painless and dignified, and was brought in to replace the barbarity of frying someone alive on the electric chair or having their chest blasted open by firing squad. But so far, the lethal injection seems far worse than these other more barbaric forms of execution, and it's also unreliable. On average, 7% of executions by lethal injection are botched, compared to just 3% by hanging, 2% by the electric chair, and 0% by firing squad. One last detail that I'd like you to consider is that despite everything you've heard about Lockett's execution, it wouldn't actually qualify as botched by this stage because the use of midazolam was standard procedure. It was, however, grim as it is, about to get far worse. If we remember, Clayton Lockett received his first injection of midazolam at 6:23 p.m. By 6:36 p.m., 13 minutes after the sedative, Lockett then received the last 2 drugs, which stopped the heart and lung function. Death usually occurs within 7 minutes after the last 2 drugs are administered, which means that by 6:43 p.m, Lockett should have been pronounced dead. In reality, he wouldn't die until another 30 minutes had passed, and the whole time he was in even worse agony than I had previously described. You see, up until now, we've been operating under the assumption that the drugs were delivered intravenously by an IV needle inserted in the femoral vein at his groin. But unfortunately for Lockett, at some stage between the IV being secured and the injection of the drugs, there was a problem with the IV line in his groin, and nobody noticed it because it was hidden under a privacy cloth. This meant that instead of the drugs entering his bloodstream as intended, they simply sank into the tissue around the groin, or didn't enter his body at all. This is why it took him a full 13 minutes to show signs of unconsciousness, despite receiving a dosage that should have knocked him out within less than minutes. And then he was finally able to struggle against his restraints and talk to the staff to tell them that there was something wrong, despite having been just pronounced unconscious. The midazolam wasn't properly in his bloodstream. The staff then sat and waited as Lockett convulsed in his gurney, trying to speak out, half paralysed as his face twisted in agony. The lethal drugs were still killing him, but instead of being delivered directly to the heart and lungs via the bloodstream, they were simply pooling into the flesh around his groin and slowly inching their way up the body and towards the major organs. I mentioned earlier that potassium chloride is extremely painful when in the body, and I will leave you to imagine the excruciating pain this would have inflicted as it soaked into that very sensitive area of flesh in and around the groin. After nearly 20 minutes of watching this horrifying sight unfold, the staff finally began to ask questions about why Lockett wasn't dying and why he was showing signs of immense suffering. And so when one of the doctors investigated to see what had gone wrong, they discovered that IV, which was not properly connected, either because it had fallen out of the blood vessel or that Lockett's vein itself had collapsed. At this stage, Oklahoma Department of Corrections Director Robert Patton was informed by the doctor that the IV line had failed and that the drugs had either been absorbed into the tissue or leaked out completely. Patton then asked the doctor if Lockett had at least received enough of the drug to kill him, to which the doctor replied, no. And then the director was informed that they didn't have any drugs left over in order to finish the job. As a result, at 6:56 p.m, the execution was officially halted, about 20 minutes after Lockett had received his excruciating dose of lethal poison directly into his inner thigh. There was a brief discussion between prison officials on whether or not they should take Lockett to hospital in order to try and get him help, but before they could make a decision, the poison was able to leak into Lockett's system and he suffered a fatal heart attack and was pronounced dead at 7:06 p.m, a whopping 43 minutes after the procedure had began. As a result, they actually postponed another execution, which was scheduled to take place 2 hours later using the very same procedure. But they wanted to stop and make sure everything was fine and that they could figure out what the problem with the procedure was. The fault, however, was determined to be the IV line, which failed due to Lockett's collapsed vein, and no blame was given to the unique cocktail of drugs which had, at that stage, been untested. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Clayton Lockett was reluctant to cooperate with his executioners on the big day, and what I didn't tell you is that the reason he behaved this way was because he was utterly terrified. Shortly before the execution, Lockett's stepmother, named LaDonna Hollins, was reported to have said, "I want to know what mixture of drugs are you going to use now? Is this instant? Is this going to cause horrible pain? I know he's scared." He said he's not scared of the dying as much as the drugs administered. It would turn out that Lockett was right to be afraid. His execution couldn't have been more painful. Despite the enormous public horror that the case of Lockett produced, it was far from the last case in which the lethal injection had gone wrong, and it certainly wasn't the first. In 2006, a man named Angel Diaz was subjected to the lethal injection in Florida. Like Clayton Lockett, there had been an error with the IV line, meaning that the drugs were simply dumped into his tissue rather than his bloodstream. A second dose was then administered, and after 35 minutes of suffering, he was pronounced dead. Again, in 2014, Dennis McGuire was subjected to lethal injection. His death took more than 25 minutes, and according to reports, he was seen gasping for air, choking and snorting for 10 to 13 minutes after the drugs had been administered. Now, I know what you're thinking, that all of these are either outlier cases that were botched, or they're cases that include the use of midazolam, rather than the much more effective and typical pentobarbital or sodium thiopental. Well, as fortune would have it, in 2005, a group of University of Miami researchers and a death row attorney published a letter in The Lancet. In the article, they investigated toxicology reports from Arizona, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and found that post-mortem concentrations of sedatives in the blood were lower than that required for surgery in 88% of executed inmates, and that nearly half of all inmates had concentrations consistent with awareness, meaning that they would have felt every ounce of suffering possible as the chemical cocktail burns its way to the heart, paralysing the body along the way. Now remember, this study was measuring the good drugs, thiopental and pentobarbital, which actually induce a state of unconsciousness in the victim. But in recent years, midazolam, the same drug used on Clayton Lockett, has become the go-to substance, which, to say again, is not an anaesthetic, but a sedative. As of today, there are still 7 states in the US which practice the death penalty with the use of midazolam as standard procedure. As for the lethal injection itself, there are 28 states in the US where it's practiced, but it's also used in China, Vietnam, Thailand, Nigeria, Guatemala, and the Maldives. Anyway, that's the lethal injection, designed to be a humane alternative to more crude methods of execution, but in reality, so much worse than you think.